Chapter 2585. The latest chapter of the extraordinary primeval world as soon as possible. All this while, I seem to have neglected the potential of my body. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind, and he suddenly felt that the suppression he suffered in this land of opportunity this time was not entirely a bad thing. Of course, after all, his realm had already reached the peak of the sixth tribulation. This kind of comprehension was not enough to allow him to immediately improve tremendously. In fact, if he truly released all the suppression, the strength that he currently possessed would not improve too much because of it. However, this kind of comprehension alone was already a lot of guidance for his future cultivation. It was even enough for him to find a new direction in his worldview, and his future path became more and more open. At this moment, his body was still like a black hole, absorbing the endless heat around him. He had only stood there for a short while, and ice had already appeared around him, gradually encasing him in ice. However, such a change was obviously nothing to him. He did not even feel sluggish because of it, and he continued to move forward slowly. Those living beings that liked the cold couldn't help but retreat at this moment. Although Luo Fan did not release a very powerful aura, and even the various physiological activities in his body had been completely restrained, making him look extremely ordinary, the nobility of his life essence was still there. These living beings were extremely powerful creatures to begin with. At this moment, as soon as they saw Luo Fan, they clearly felt that the living being in front of them was an existence that they could not resist. In fact, they would definitely be turned into dust with just a puff of air from him. Under such a feeling, how could these living beings not retreat? At this moment, they did not even have the mood to pay attention to the coldness that they liked the most. Naturally, Luo Fan had no interest in paying attention to these living beings. He raised his head to look at the sky, and with a slight thought, he took a step forward. Under his extremely subtle use of power, the air seemed to be a physical substance, and it gently lifted him up. In just a few steps, he had already arrived in midair and was floating there effortlessly. It was as if the transcendent power was still in his body and could still be used. And all of this was achieved by slightly manipulating the heat in the surroundings. Heat could cause changes in the air. This was something that even mortals knew very well, not to mention Luo Fan. And now, what Luo Fan was doing was using the heat to change the air around his body, causing the air around his body to produce various subtle, lifting forces that easily offset the gravity he suffered, allowing his body to float in midair without making any movements. However, all of this actually happened within Luo Fan's instincts. In fact, he didn't even pay any attention to his actions because of this. In his own mind, he just wanted to do it, so he did it. As for the thousands or tens of thousands of changes contained within, he didn't feel anything at all. This was also a manifestation of his body becoming stronger. Only when his body was truly and fundamentally powerful could there be such an effect. If it wasn't because his body was fundamentally powerful, but because he had incredible abilities with the help of the transcendent power, he could also easily float in midair. However, in the process, he needed to have a thought to guide the changes in his power in order to be able to float. Even though such thoughts were extremely rare and lasted for extremely short periods of time, it was almost an instinctive reaction, and it was difficult for him to notice it. However, a thought was a thought, and it still needed to go through his mind and soul. How could it be as natural as it was now? Floating in midair, Luo Fan looked into the distance. In an instant, the land within a radius of tens of millions of kilometers was imprinted into his eyes. The area within tens of millions of kilometers was completely barren, and there were no traces of intelligent living beings. Even if there were living beings, they were just like the various ordinary beasts in the mountain range below. Even though he had expected it, Luo Fan still sighed when he saw it for himself. There were obviously many intelligent living beings in this world, and it was very likely that they had stepped into this place from various large worlds. In fact, there were definitely 7, 8, or even 9 tribulation powerhouses among them. For the current Luo Fan, Such an existence was an extremely powerful existence. From them, Luo Fan might encounter great danger, and he might even lose his life. But at the same time, their existence was also a great opportunity for him. If he could obtain some information about this world from them, he would definitely be able to shorten the journey of Luo Fan's exploration of this world, allowing him to take fewer detours. In fact, if he was not careful, he might even be able to learn from them how to walk the path to a higher level. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan naturally looked forward to being able to communicate with the intelligent living beings in this world. However, the situation in front of him showed that his hopes were clearly in vain. There were no traces of intelligent living beings within a radius of tens of millions of miles. It was impossible for him to come into contact with those living beings, let alone communicate with them. Sighing in his heart, he could only change his target in another direction. As his eyes flickered slightly, the various things that he saw in his eyes had already undergone subtle changes. After experiencing the tempering of the heat in his body and the sublimation of his chi and blood, his current eyesight was already hundreds of times stronger than it could have been in the beginning. Moreover, because of the heat, his eyesight now seemed to have been modified, and he could directly see the existence of heat. At this moment, he glanced around and saw which mountain range had the most heat and which had the least heat within a radius of tens of millions of miles. He could see through all of this with a single glance. With a slight thought, he had already chosen a mountain range that was a dozen or so mountain ranges far away from this location. In his eyes, that mountain range was the place with the most heat in this area. If he had to compare the heat in it, it was more than 100 times stronger than the heat that he released when he was cultivating in the mountain range below. Looking from afar, the air above the mountain range was distorting, and all kinds of strange light and shadows were projected into the sky, making it seem like there was a hidden space there. This situation clearly meant that there was some kind of source of heat in a mountain range. It was either an underground volcano or some kind of treasure that could emit heat. At this moment, Luo Fan's mentality was similar to that of the living beings that liked high temperatures that had gathered around his cave abode. After choosing his target, Luo Fan's figure flashed, and, as if he had teleported, he disappeared from where he was. After a long time after he disappeared, there was a shocking explosion in the air where he was originally, as if some kind of terrifying bomb had been forcefully detonated there. The explosion lasted for a long time, and terrifying shock waves spread out in all directions from that location, making it seem like some kind of terrifying power was constantly exploding in the sky. This lasted for more than 10 minutes before the commotion gradually disappeared. Just as this explosion occurred in the distance, a similar explosion occurred in another location thousands of miles away. It also lasted for more than 10 minutes before the commotion subsided. Then, the explosions that were thousands of miles away formed a clear path that led straight to the mountain range that Luo Fan had targeted, the mountain range that looked like a real, flaming mountain. At the beginning, the location was tens of millions of miles away from the mountain range. Even if it was thousands of miles away, there would only be one explosion. By the time the explosions reached the mountain range, the number of explosions had reached over 10,000. Moreover, each explosion lasted for more than 10 minutes, so it went without saying how great the commotion was in the end. At this moment, the region within a radius of several tens of millions of kilometers rumbled like thunder. The deafening sound caused all living beings in the region to tremble in fear. They were worried that an unimaginably terrifying existence would descend from the sky and wipe them out. All this commotion was naturally caused by Luo Fan stepping on the air in midair to quickly shift his position. With Luo Fan's current body, it took him less than a minute to cross the distance of tens of millions of miles. When he arrived at the target mountain range, the explosion that he caused at the beginning was still ongoing. It could even be said that it was still at the beginning stage. The power and heat that he used throughout the entire process was shockingly terrifying. If it really landed, the power would be enough to crush dozens of mountains each time, and the heat would be enough to turn a mountain into a flaming mountain. The huge commotion in the air was proof of this. It was easy to imagine how strong the backlash that Luo Fan's body had to endure in order to produce such a huge effect. If a living being whose body was only at the limit of an ordinary person suffered such a backlash, even the first step would be enough to completely crush their body, let alone 10,000 steps. However, at this moment, the backlash was not painful at all for Luo Fan. In fact, he did not even feel much. In fact, he only felt that this method of traveling was no different from ordinary living beings walking on the ground. With this feeling, it was easy to imagine Luo Fan's attitude toward the various movements behind him. At this moment, he did not care about the movements behind him at all. He only looked at the flaming mountain range below and secretly searched for the source of the heat. The center of the heat in this mountain range was a mountain peak that looked like a volcano. At this moment, he could clearly see endless heat continuously spreading from the mountain, gradually spreading to the entire mountain range. It caused the rocks in the mountain range to turn red, and there were even traces of magma flowing on the rocks. However, the magma was quickly extinguished and solidified, which was why the existence of the magma was not obvious. A volcano. Looking at the mountain in the middle, Luo Fan no longer hesitated. In a flash, he had already arrived at the entrance of the hollow mountain in the middle. Here, the surging heat pounced on him. A feeling of fullness appeared in Luo Fan's heart at this moment. There's indeed enough heat. Sensing this feeling of fullness that he had never felt ever since he started absorbing heat from the outside world, Luo Fan had a satisfied look on his face. The heat below was enough for him to use for a period of time. As he began to absorb the surrounding heat, the boundless heat coming from below began to continuously gather towards his body. It continuously poured into his body and began to gradually converge into his internal qi gene circulation system. It melted into his qi gene, causing his qi gene to become more and more pure and powerful. As a large portion of the heat was drawn and absorbed by him, the heat from the mountain range in all directions also began to decrease. This decrease was not considered large. If the remaining heat was placed in another mountain range, it would be enough to maintain the shape of a flaming mountain. However, at this moment, in this extremely hot mountain range, the decrease in heat was already enough to break the heat balance in this mountain range, causing gusts of cool wind to appear in this mountain range. It began to sweep up the sand and stones in the entire mountain range, as well as the magma that existed in this mountain range. Naturally, Luo Fan was not in the mood to care about this. Feeling the heat that continuously surged in from outside his body, he took a deep breath, leaped up, and fiercely jumped toward the source of the heat in the middle. With this jump, he did not use any other methods to slow down his speed of descent. He only allowed his body to accelerate crazily under the effect of gravity, continuously sinking into the abyss of this mountain range. The surrounding heat became stronger and stronger as he continued to descend. In the end, it even obscured his senses, causing him to only feel that his surroundings had been completely covered by the boundless light transformed from the heat. He could only rely on his body's senses to know that he was still descending. Chapter 2586. The latest chapter of the extraordinary untainted land. Looking down from the crater of the volcano, the bottom was filled with red light. At first glance, one would think that there was endless lava flowing down there. However, as one went deeper and deeper into the red light, one would realize that there was no lava down there. Below, there was clearly an even denser, almost tangible red light. At this moment, Luo Fan gradually went deeper and deeper into the volcano. However, he realized that the red light had gradually turned into the shape of flowing water, making him feel like he had fallen into the sea. As for the heat absorption produced by his body, it did not slow down at all. At every moment, it swept up the endless heat around him, causing the surrounding heat to continuously flow into his body, causing a downward spiral tornado to appear around his body. It was born from the crater of the volcano and pointed straight down to the source of the red light, or rather, the source of the heat. At this moment, Luo Fan clearly felt that the world he was in was not an ordinary world. Instead, it contained endless mysteries of cultivation and even the mysteries of true saints. It was a land of opportunity created by the true saints of many worlds. If it was in an ordinary world, how could there be a situation where the crater of the volcano pointed directly to the source of the heat law? At this moment, Luo Fan had already regarded the heat as his reliance to break the fundamental limits of this world. At this moment, his desire for heat was naturally almost infinite. At this moment, there was endless heat around him for him to absorb. Naturally, he did not hesitate to use all his strength to activate the heat absorption of his body, crazily absorbing the endless suction from the outside world. This caused the speed of the flow of energy in his body to unknowingly accelerate to a level that was tens of thousands of times its original speed. At this stage, even with Luo Fan's ability to control it, it was difficult for him to control the various movements within his body. Rumble, rumble, rumble. This was the sound of his heartbeat. Walala, walala, walala. This was the sound produced by the blood flowing in his blood vessels. Sizzle, 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 sizzle. This was the sound produced by the slow squirming of his internal organs in his chest. All sorts of sounds gathered together and were constantly emitted from his body. They spread in all directions and continuously surged in the depths of the volcano. In the end, it spread out along the mouth of the volcano, making it seem as if the volcano was about to erupt, causing an incomparably huge commotion. The commotion spread far and wide, causing all the living beings in the mountain range to have all sorts of indescribable associations, and they all began to panic. This volcano had been like this ever since it appeared. But all this time, this volcano had never erupted. It had always maintained its current appearance. It looked dangerous, but it was actually extremely stable. But now, the volcano was showing signs of eruption. How could these living beings not panic? A volcano that had yet to erupt had already turned this mountain range into such a state. If it really erupted, what would this mountain range look like? What would happen to them? The creatures who could barely survive in this mountain range, then? All of this made those living beings who had the slightest ability to think panic. In fact, many living beings even began to rush out of this mountain range without saying anything. It was as if this volcano was the abyss of hell. Naturally, Luo Fan did not care about all of this. At this moment, he continued to descend. The surrounding red light had unknowingly turned into a solid state. He shuttled through it, as if he was shuttling through a solid state. Of course, this change in form was nothing to Luo Fan. He moved in this solid state as if he was moving in the air. If he did not use his common sense to measure it, he might not even realize that he had sunk into a solid state. However, the change in form did not affect him, but it did not mean that the change in the red light was not enough to affect him. On the contrary, as the red light turned into a solid state, his body began to gradually turn red as if it was being burned. The reason was naturally that after the red light turned into this form, the amount of heat contained in it had exceeded his ability to absorb it. It seems that my efforts in this aspect are still not enough. This was the thought that flashed through Luo Fan's mind at this moment. His absorption of heat was actually unable to suppress the heat in the outside world, and he actually let the heat hurt him. This was very normal for ordinary living beings, or even ordinary cultivators. After all, who would have the confidence that their means were already superior to heaven and earth, and that all the heat in the world could not break through their defenses? However, it was clear that this was only true for ordinary living beings or cultivators. For Luo Fan, this situation was unacceptable to him. After all, Luo Fan was an existence at the peak of the sixth tribulation. Such an existence was billions of times stronger than the realm that his body was currently displaying. When he was not suppressed, the heat in the surroundings that had already burned him could only make him feel warm at most. Not to mention injuring him, it was not even enough for him to use his own power to resist it. But right now, this heat had already burned his body. It was continuously burning his body, causing his injuries to worsen with every passing second. This situation was simply like a person suddenly discovering that his life was actually threatened by an ant. How could he accept this? Therefore, in his opinion, there was obviously only one reason for this result. That was, in terms of the cultivation of heat, he still hadn't reached the limit that he could reach. At this point, he instead felt that it was natural that he could not use this heat to drive him to the connate grand Luo realm. He had not even reached the limit, so how was it possible for him to break through it? At that moment, he calmed his thoughts and began to activate the qi gene in his body. He began to absorb the endless heat that had accumulated in the outside world. He slowly adjusted the circulation of the qi gene in his body and slowly reconstructed the heat circulation in his body. This was not an easy thing to do. After all, in his opinion, the structure of the heat circulation in his body and the flow of energy had already reached a point where it could no longer be improved or sublimated. Under such circumstances, it went without saying how difficult it would be to overthrow it and find a brand new method, a brand new possibility. However, a person's potential was limitless. This was especially so for a terrifying existence like Luo Fan, who had already reached the sixth tribulation. His potential was far beyond anyone's imagination. In this situation, where he had clearly discovered his own weakness and shortcomings, his mind flashed with inspiration. Countless situations that he thought were impossible in the past began to appear in his mind. Various methods that he could not think of before and details that he could not figure out began to quickly appear in his mind. Very soon, a more exquisite and perfect structure gradually appeared in his mind. As these changes occurred, he began to quickly change the flow of energy. He gave more changes to the details and paid more attention to them. In an instant, the speed at which he absorbed the heat in the outside world increased again. The burning on his body began to weaken bit by bit. However, it was obvious that the weakening speed was rather slow. After all, there was just too much heat in the outside world. A little adjustment was not enough for him to completely absorb all the heat in the surroundings into his body. He could only continue to adjust, sublimate, and evolve that structure to be able to completely absorb all the heat in the end. At the very least, he had to make the speed at which the heat surged into his body and the speed at which it surged in from all directions. Only then could his body not be burned, and he could safely exist in the boundless red light. As he went deeper and deeper into the volcano, the surrounding red light gradually obscured his vision. Whether it was up or down, left or right, at a glance, there was only boundless red light left in his surroundings. Whether it was the sky or the earth, or even the mountains around the volcano, they no longer existed in his eyes. Faintly, Luo Fan felt that he was getting closer and closer to the source of the heat. He could predict that the source of the heat would definitely be many times stronger than the heat he was feeling now. And now, he was already barely able to withstand the heat. If it increased by several times, his fate would probably be worrisome. This world might not directly kill him. After all, his essence was there. With the heat in front of him, it was simply not enough to completely shatter his essence, which had already reached the peak of the sixth tribulation. However, he was very clear in his heart. Even if he would not die from the heat, the result was definitely not something he was willing to accept. Just like how one would feel hungry after not eating for a long time, if he encountered an encounter that could cause his body to die, this world would probably have a way to make him suffer a similar punishment. No matter what the punishment was, no matter how ingenious the way this world punished him was, Luo Fan definitely had no interest in enjoying that kind of punishment. Therefore, at this time, he could only try his best to open his mind and stimulate his own inspiration. He worked hard to perfect the energy circulation in his body and perfect the heat circulation in his body. The greater the pressure, the greater the potential that Luo Fan released. The trajectory of the energy flow, which was also the heat circulation system, began to change rapidly. Tens of millions of details were added to these trajectories at every moment, causing the trajectories to rapidly sublimate at every moment. In this way, in just a few dozen minutes, The heat circulation system in his body was already more than 100 times more complicated than when he first entered the volcano. Moreover, this circulation system that was more than 100 times more complicated had also increased the efficiency of his absorption of the external heat by more than 100 times. Even the tempering of his body and chi and blood by the heat had been greatly improved because of this. Unknowingly, his body had already been improved by several times compared to before. Vaguely, he had already come into contact with the barrier between the primordial pure yang stage and the innate zenith heaven stage, and was automatically attacking the barrier again and again. Of course, although the impact was an impact, the force of the impact was still insignificant compared to the barrier. At least, the barrier was not damaged at all under the impact. No matter how the impact continued, it did not budge at all. Fortunately, Luo Fan did not pay attention to that at this moment. Otherwise, he would probably feel defeated in this situation. At this moment, Luo Fan's entire mind was focused on the countless inspirations that burst out in his heart. He used all of his thoughts to adjust his body at all times, to adjust his heat circulation, and to adjust the flow of his qi gene. At this moment, the heat in the surroundings had vaguely reached a balance with the power he was absorbing. Although his body had not completely escaped from the burning heat and could not be unaffected by the heat like he was in other regions or other heat sources, it was not as if he was in the air. However, the burning did not intensify, and it only maintained a state that stabilized his body. His entire body was red, and it was obvious that he was being burned. If there was no origin of the laws below, Luo Fan might have been satisfied with this situation. However, it was obvious that the origin of the laws below, which was constantly emitting endless red light and endless heat, still existed. Right now, he could barely maintain this balance, but that was only because the source of the laws was still below. If he really sank into the origin of the laws, the heat would instantly skyrocket by dozens or even hundreds or thousands of times. At that time, if he still entered in his current state, what awaited him would probably be his entire body being burned into powder in an instant. In other words, he would be punished by the world by being burned into powder. He did not want to see such a situation at all. Chapter 2587. Luo Fan curled up his body, as if he had returned to his mother's womb. The endless heat in the surroundings was continuously drilling into his body through every pore on his body. It gradually integrated into the qi gene inside his body, integrated into his heat circulation, and was then purified. Then, it merged with the materialization of the world that filled his body at this moment, causing all kinds of extremely subtle changes. In this process, Luo Fan's body was faintly undergoing an indescribable transition. It began to gradually advance from the primordial pure yang stage to the innate grand Luo stage that was self-sufficient and did not rely on external forces. The source of the heat law in the surroundings seemed to be attracted by a black hole as it slowly rotated. The heat that was originally spreading in all directions began to reverse its direction and shrink inwards, continuously seeping into Luo Fan's body. Under this change, the temperature around the source of the heat law began to slowly decrease. After a few days, the temperature had dropped to normal temperature. Although it was not as cold as the mountain range that Luo Fan stayed in before, it was already a world of difference compared to the situation where the heat alone was enough to fill the entire mountain range with magma. Time ticked by. Unknowingly, more than 3 months had passed. 100 days after Luo Fan sank into the source of the heat law, Luo Fan's body trembled slightly as his eyes, which had been tightly shut for 100 days, suddenly opened. As he opened his eyes, an incomparably ferocious aura gushed out from his body, directly tearing apart the source of the heat rule. It completely tore apart the original source of the heat rule, turning it into countless fragments. With a sudden sweep, all of them were sucked into his body. Moreover, this aura did not calm down because of this. Instead, it continued to surge outwards, stirring up the surrounding void, and even stirring up the surrounding laws, causing all sorts of strange distortions in the surrounding light and shadows. It looked as if the world itself was distorted by this aura. Boom, 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 boom. At this moment, an earth-shattering roar erupted from the depths of the earth and began to roll upwards and outwards. In the distance, the ground that was pushed away by the heat law source began to shake violently. Outside the mountain range, in the sky above, the clouds were scattered by the ferocious aura. As for the many plants in the mountain range, they were all crushed by this aura. The entire mountain range, which was originally full of vitality and was about to return to its normal state, became even more miserable than the blazing mountain when this aura swept past. Although the blazing mountain range was barren and lifeless, it was still barren and lifeless. On the whole, it still looked like a normal mountain range. However, under Luo Fan's ferocious aura, every inch of the mountain range seemed to have been plowed through. All the rocks, plants, and even the creatures that had been bold enough to enter the mountain range seemed to have been thrown into a blender and churned for a few hours. They were completely pulverized, as if some powerhouse had used an unparalleled amount of patience to break everything down bit by bit. Boom, boom, boom. This aura expanded frantically until it reached the end of the mountain range. It only stopped when it vaguely affected the mountain range outside. At this moment, the entire area had already turned into a strange domain, an imposing domain that belonged solely to Luo Fan. Within this domain, everything, even energy, even the laws of time, and even space-time were all affected by the domain. They were even controlled. This kind of situation continued. The huge commotion spread far and wide, causing the surrounding mountains to fall into chaos. As long as they had some instincts, they would all be worried if this aura would extend to their mountain range, if they would also be included under the crushing pressure of this aura. Under such circumstances, it would be strange if those living creatures did not escape. Their escape naturally caused a huge commotion and created waves of chaos. In the depths of the ground, Luo Fan felt extremely comfortable all over his body at this time. His worldview of the laws had completely fused with the heat in his body during the past 100 days, and it had also completely fused with the body that he was currently displaying. The heat, his body, and his view of the world of laws fused together, and it created an indescribable change. It faintly broke through the absolute suppression of this world towards him, allowing his body to break through the shackles of the primordial pure sun realm and directly step into the innate golden immortal realm. At this moment, his body was completely transparent, both inside and out. His strength and power were tens of thousands of times stronger than before. Moreover, more importantly, he could now use some extraordinary means. Not only was he self-sufficient, but he also saw a brand new path that led straight to his peak and even to the limit that this world could accommodate. It went without saying how huge this harvest was for him. How could he not be happy with such a harvest and a path that was close to the great path of the sun? How could he not be excited? The heat flowed up and down his body like flowing water. As it flowed, some kind of mysterious law was constantly released, gradually changing the circulation of the heat. It was continuously absorbed by his worldview of the laws, slowly turning into nutrients for the growth of the worldview of the laws, and becoming a guide for the perfection of the worldview of the laws. This law was none other than the subtle law contained in the source of the heat law. Although the source of the heat law was emitting endless heat all the time, the laws contained in it had nothing to do with heat. Or rather, it didn't have much to do with it. That kind of law was actually formed from the various mysterious principles contained in this world itself. It existed in this heat only because this ball of heat coincidentally fused with this law. However, it wasn't because the law gave birth to the heat, nor was it because the heat gave birth to the law. At this time, Luo Fan spent 100 days to completely absorb the heat law source into his body. This kind of law naturally entered his body and began to circulate along with the heat in his body. Bit by bit, it played a role inside his body and gradually melted into various things inside his body, turning into nutrients for his growth. This is a kind of opportunity. At this moment, Luo Fan slowly regained his composure, and a faint smile appeared on his face. The formation of the source of the law was the result of all kinds of coincidences. If it was in a normal world, there might be a chance of forming such a similar source of the law if billions of such worlds were built at the same time. However, now, in this world, he had actually found such a source of the law after walking such a short distance in this area. Obviously, this meant that there were definitely many such sources of the law in this world. Of course, it might not be in such a form, or it might not be formed by such mysteries and principles, but must be similar and of the same level. It was also an existence that had many effects on cultivators, and could even benefit a cultivator at Luo Fan's level greatly. Only in this way could it really be such a coincidence that Luo Fan was able to meet one after walking such a short distance from where he appeared. In fact, this source of the law might not be comparable to the place of opportunity left by a true saint on the 5th level of the Road of Tao Master. But in fact, it was not much different in nature. Although the land of opportunity left behind by a true saint was filled with endless mysteries, most of it was still effective against the light of the heavens and earth. There were even more mysteries and principles that an existence at Luo Fan's level couldn't understand or comprehend. This kind of existence was indeed very precious and hard to come by. However, compared to Luo Fan, the benefits were just that. What he could obtain was not much at all. In comparison, although the principles and mysteries contained in this source of heat law were much weaker than that of the place of opportunity, the good thing was that Luo Fan was qualified to comprehend them. He was qualified to understand these principles and mysteries. In other words, he had the ability to completely absorb these principles and mysteries. In this way, if the principles and mysteries that Luo Fan could absorb were to be considered, there was actually no essential difference between this source of laws and the land of opportunity that he had discovered on the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. From this, it could be seen how precious this place of opportunity was. Although this source of the law was actually of a lower level than the place of opportunity found on the 5th level of the Road of Tao Master. However, one should not forget that this was only a source of the law that Luo Fan had casually discovered. In this boundless world, it was unknown whether there were tens of millions or hundreds of millions of such places, or even billions, tens of billions, or even hundreds of billions of such places. In this way, compared to the place of opportunity found on the 5th level of the Road of Tao Master, this place was tens of thousands of times stronger. While these thoughts flashed through his mind, Luo Fan's figure had already rushed out of the crater of the volcano. The entire process was no longer as noisy as when he rushed over from the ice mountain range. In contrast, when he stepped out of the ground this time, he felt a little like when his cultivation was not suppressed, and he could still use all kinds of extraordinary means. From his appearance, it was clear that he was able to use some extraordinary means. Of course, this was only a little. If it was any other cultivator, the extent of this kind of extraordinary means would at most be able to make them feel weak, and it would definitely not be able to produce a strong effect. In fact, it might even be worse than the various means that one could use by relying on the foundation of physics. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan was not an ordinary cultivator, and his means were beyond the imagination of ordinary cultivators. Even though he only had a few tricks up his sleeves, he was still able to pull off something that countless other cultivators couldn't. In fact, if he wanted to, he could even open up a world at this moment. If such means were compared to ordinary cultivators, even existences at the peak of the sage-to-be would not be a match for him. And this was only for the time being. As he continued to absorb the principles and mysteries contained in the source of the law, the extraordinary means that he could use would become more and more abundant. At that time, the means that he could use would become more and more profound and incredible. It would not be long before even false saints and false saints would not be a match for him, let alone sage-to-be. Given that Luo Fan was at the peak of the 6th tribulation, this level of strength was naturally nothing much. However, in a world that completely restricted extraordinary means, this level of strength was enough for him to roam freely in this world. At the very least, there would be very, very few natural environments in this world that could harm him from now on. In this way, for him, what he needed to be wary of was only the living beings that existed in this world. Among them, the living beings that were also outsiders like him were the main focus of his attention. Looking down, Luo Fan saw the miserable state of the mountain range. He could not help but feel a little apologetic as he looked at the mountain range that seemed to have been minced up. This mountain range had given him such great benefits, but in the end, it ended up like this because of a moment of carelessness. No matter how he put it, it did not make sense. At that moment, he thought to himself, perhaps I should give this mountain range some benefits so that it can recover. With that thought, he no longer hesitated and waved his hand. In an instant, the space in the entire mountain range began to tremble violently, as if there was an invisible hand grabbing hold of the space in the mountain range and causing it to tremble continuously. As this happened, the terrain of the entire mountain range began to undergo various subtle changes. Chapter 2588. The vitality that was originally hidden in the depths of the earth began to emerge at this moment, causing the vitality that was originally dying in the entire mountain range to gradually flourish. All sorts of extraordinary effects were revealed, and in just a few dozen breaths, the vitality in the entire mountain range had become vigorous. The greenery that had originally completely disappeared had unknowingly spread over the entire mountain range. In just a short period of time, the entire mountain range had changed its appearance. Although it was still more barren than the other mountain ranges outside, it was already a world of difference compared to before. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan revealed a faint smile. To be able to do such a thing was an impossible task in his eyes before. But now, to him, it was just a matter of a few thoughts. The difference was so great that even he could not help but feel excited. During his previous modifications, the volcano in the center had completely healed. At this moment, the crater at the center looked like an extremely ordinary mountain. Although the vegetation there was much more exuberant compared to the other regions of the mountain peaks, with a single glance, Luo Fan understood the situation of the entire mountain range in his heart. He didn't stay any longer. His figure flashed, and he silently flew into the distance. There was no smoke or fire during the entire process. It was as if he had recovered all of his extraordinary abilities. As he disappeared, the mountain range gradually returned to its original tranquility. In the following period of time, more and more living beings entered the mountain range from various places and began to settle in the mountain range. The mountain range gradually became part of the ecological cycle of the entire area, causing the abnormalities in the mountain range to unknowingly disappear without a trace. In just a short month, one could no longer see the origin of the law of heat in this place, nor could one see the existence of the flame mountain. However, this no longer mattered to Luo Fan, who had already left. At this moment, under the guidance of his body, he randomly chose a direction and kept moving forward. Finally, after a few days, he arrived in front of an ice field. The ice field was extremely vast. As far as the eye could see, the world was sparkling. Even with his eyesight, he could not see the end of the ice field. For Luo Fan, who had already pushed his body to the innate Great Luo realm, it was obvious how unbelievable this situation was. As expected of a land of opportunities, there are such incomprehensible things everywhere. Luo Fan praised inwardly as he looked at the vast and boundless ice field. He could sense that there was a source of the law of cold in the depths of the ice field that was similar to the source of the law of heat. Moreover, the source of the law was much greater than the source of the law of heat, and its influence was also greater. Moreover, the source of the law even had some sort of branch, as if there were dozens of areas with the source of the law of cold. It was as if there were dozens of branches from the source of the law of cold. In the past, he would not have been able to sense such a place. However, at this moment, under the agitation of the source of the law of heat that was constantly circulating and being digested by his body, an indescribable feeling was transmitted from the source of the law of cold. It resonated with the source of the law of heat in his body, allowing him to lock onto the location of the source of the law of cold. In fact, he could currently sense quite a number of existences that were similar to the source of the law of heat. However, among them, the one that was most compatible with the source of the law of heat and resonated the most strongly was the source of the law of cold in the depths of the ice field in front of him. Luo Fan only needed to give a little thought to understand the reason for this. The source of the law that he had obtained previously was manifested with the help of heat. On the other hand, other similar existences usually manifested in different ways. It could be in the form of a cloud, a gust of air, a ball of flame, a ray of light, or even a living being. Only the source of the law in the depths of the ice field in front of him was manifested in a cold way. This was clearly compatible with his source of the law of heat, and it was only natural that the two would resonate the most strongly. However, even though he had already sensed the existence of the source of the law in front of him, Luo Fan did not immediately enter it. After all, the source of the law of heat in his body was still constantly assimilating into his body, into his heat circulation system, and into his worldview. Under such circumstances, he was like a person who had just stuffed a large amount of food into his stomach. Perhaps he could still eat after digesting the food, but it would only be torture. Obviously, at this time, Luo Fan did not want to suffer such torment. Since he did not want to suffer such torment, the most important thing for him now was to digest the origin of the rules in his body. He had to shatter and absorb all the nutrients that he could absorb. Only then would he be able to take the next step in his cultivation. Although he had mastered some extraordinary means, there were not many of them. Compared to an existence at the pinnacle of the sixth tribulation, he was almost negligible. Therefore, even if he could make use of this extraordinary means to do things that countless ordinary cultivators could not do, and even many things that pinnacle of the sage-to-be couldn't do, Luo Fan still felt an inexplicable pressure at this moment. He only felt that the endless shackles around him were suppressing him, making it difficult for his worldview to expand and his spirit to expand. This situation felt rather familiar to him. Wasn't this the state of his worldview when faced with other worldviews that had already constructed a perfect world and a greater world? Is this what it feels like to have a worldview? Experiencing the omnipresent shackles and the terrifying pressure that came from all directions, Luo Fan's mood gradually calmed down. Even though he had already gathered the precise time for the arrival of the seventh Great Tribulation, there was still a huge gap between him and a true saint. This was something that he had always been clear about. In fact, even if he had passed the seventh or eighth Great Tribulation, he would still be an insignificant existence to a true saint, let alone his current self. With this kind of awareness, he lost all kinds of impetuous feelings, and his mood became peaceful in the face of this feeling of being suppressed by a truly perfect worldview. Using this as an analogy, it could be said that it was already a huge breakthrough for him to find a way out of this unimaginable suppression and shackles and make use of a little extraordinary ability. This meant that he already had some means that was faintly approaching a true saint. From this point of view, his current situation was worthy of him being extremely excited. At this moment, Luo Fan did not land on the ice field below. Instead, he directly grabbed a cloud in the void and constructed a small, crude cave abode in the void. Such a cave abode could actually be regarded as a cloud cave at most. At most, it could only be used to condense some daily necessities from the cloud chi. To be honest, it could be said to be extremely simple and crude. In fact, even when he had just transmigrated to the primordial world, he had never opened such a simple cave abode. Such a cave abode, compared to the cave abode that he used to live in, was almost the polar opposite. If it was in the past, he would definitely not stay in such a cave abode for even a moment. However, now, in such a cave abode, he seemed to be extremely safe, even if this cave abode could barely be called a cave abode. The reason for this was that his mentality had changed. His current level might be very high in the eyes of ordinary cultivators, but in the eyes of a true saint, what difference was there between him and an ant looking for food in the soil? What was the point of pursuing the nobility of such a cave abode? Moreover, Such a cave abode seemed to be truly compatible with the extraordinary ability that he had mastered. No matter how many tricks he played with the extraordinary ability, he could indeed build a more perfect cave abode. However, it was not compatible with his current level. Thus, it was somewhat flashy and impractical to construct. This kind of thing was meaningless to him now. After opening such a cloud cave abode, Luo Fan fell into a state of slumber in the cloud cave abode. The cloud cave abode gradually drifted in the void, but no matter how it drifted, it could not leave this ice field. On the contrary, it was constantly approaching the center of the ice field, where the core of the law of coldness was located. Unknowingly, it had already arrived directly above the source of the law. At this time, almost 10 years had passed since Luo Fan fell into that state of slumber. During these 10 years, Luo Fan's body was like an ordinary person who had fallen into a deep sleep. All of his physiological activities were similar to those of an ordinary person who was in a deep sleep. The whole thing seemed so ordinary. In his body, during these 10 years, the worldview of law in his body had unknowingly completely absorbed the source of the law that he had previously absorbed and integrated into the heat circulation system. The principles and mysteries contained in them were all turned into nutrients for the worldview of law, allowing the worldview of law to grow at a visible rate. Under such growth, the extraordinary ability that he could use in this world had unknowingly become more than 10,000 times stronger than before. This extraordinary ability that was more than 10,000 times stronger than before was naturally insignificant compared to the various abilities that Luo Fan had originally mastered. In fact, any cultivator who had truly stepped into the cultivation realm would be able to master even more extraordinary abilities than this. However, these extraordinary abilities could already allow Luo Fan to unleash power that had skyrocketed tens of thousands of times after fusing with his body. If it was a real battle, the current him would be comparable to a fake saint just by relying on this extraordinary ability, his body, and the heat that he had mastered in his body, which was enough to completely burn a part of the world into charred ruins. Making him comparable to a fake saint, false saints could be said to be omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient existences in a part of the world that they resided in. Luo Fan could actually rely on this extraordinary ability to fuse his body and heat to fight against such an existence. This ability could be said to have exceeded the limits of the imagination of ordinary cultivators. However, Luo Fan was not surprised by this achievement at all. When his worldview of law completely shattered and absorbed the last bit of heat, he woke up from that deep sleep. "It's finally done. It's really been a long time," he mumbled as his body trembled. The cloud cave abode completely collapsed amidst the subtle vibration, turning into surging clouds that swept in all directions. "It's been 10 years? This world is really huge." Looking around, Luo Fan instantly knew how long he had been sleeping for. At the same time, he began to sigh in his heart. This sigh was actually very simple. It was because no other cultivators from the outside world had come to this ice field in the past 10 years. This entire ice field might have changed a lot in other aspects, but in terms of traces of cultivators, it was the same as 10 years ago. It was all empty. This situation was enough to show that this ice field was definitely an insignificant place in this world. If it was not insignificant, it was impossible for no cultivators to take a fancy to the source of the cold laws contained in this ice field. Once a cultivator took a fancy to it, they would naturally come to explore it in the past 10 years. Currently, there were no traces of any cultivators coming here, so it was obvious that this place was too insignificant compared to the entire world, to the point that not many cultivators knew about the situation here. This was the only reason why this situation would occur. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan would sigh with emotion at this time. Chapter 2589. The ice field below was extremely thick. If one were to look at the thickness of the ice layer alone, one would have to calculate its thickness in tens of thousands of miles. At this moment, Luo Fan happened to be right above the source of the law of cold in the center. This was where the ice layer was the thickest and also the coldest. If an ordinary being were to appear here, it would definitely be frozen into ice within the range of tens of thousands of kilometers, and then it would fall down and smash into pieces on impact. However, it was clear that Luo Fan was fundamentally different from ordinary creatures at this moment. Not to mention the endless heat circulation system in his body that could completely isolate all the coldness in the outside world. Just the little bit of extraordinary power that he could use at this moment was enough for him to completely ignore the coldness of the ice field below. At this moment, in a flash, he had already rushed into the ice layer. As if his body had melted into flowing water, he directly sank into the deepest part of the ice layer, the source of the vast ice field's coldness. This ice field was originally an extremely large basin, but now this place had been forcibly raised. A thick layer of ice filled the basin, and at the same time, it rose high into the air. It was as if it had turned into a huge mountain range that filled the entire region. As he went deeper into the ice field, the surroundings became colder and colder. Compared to the source of the law of heat that he had encountered before, the source of the law of cold was obviously much larger, and the changes were more detailed and subtle. There were even many strange creatures faintly shuttling through the ice layer, forming a unique ecological balance system. The originally extremely barren and lifeless ice field seemed to have been turned upside down within the ice layer. The exuberant vitality that the many mountain ranges that Luo Fan had seen previously could not compare to. Moreover, the source of the law of cold was not just a single source. Instead, it was divided into dozens of branches, and each branch had its own characteristics. In other words, each branch had a certain characteristic of the source of the law of cold in the center in an extremely unimaginable way, and changed the environment within the range of the branch. If one were to look at the nature of the living beings living in it, it would mean that the living beings in each branch had a certain inclination and a certain characteristic. This tendency, this characteristic, was so strong that it was impossible to coexist. In this way, the dozens of branches that originated from the same source instead had many disputes between each other, and it was even to the extent that they viewed each other with hatred. Every once in a while, they would kill each other until blood flowed like a river, causing the ecological environment of the entire icy plains to be cleansed. At this moment, it seemed to be a point in time after a certain period of time. At this moment, as Luo Fan ventured deeper into the ice field and headed towards the origin of the cold laws, he heard battle cries coming from all directions. The creatures that he felt were full of vitality seemed to be running away and chasing after him. Vaguely, there was also the aura of slaughter. These creatures were not humanoid creatures. Their shapes were so strange that even Luo Fan found it difficult to describe the shapes of these creatures with the creatures he had seen and was familiar with. He could only sense that there was no lack of intelligent creatures among these creatures. He could even vaguely sense some traces of civilization. Of course, these were just some traces. These civilizations seemed to be unable to develop due to some kind of suppression. They could only maintain the most basic state of civilization, and they did not even have a cultivation system. Even the most powerful creatures could only rely on their own bodies to take on their opponents. However, it was also because of this that this kind of war was especially cruel. Every victory represented an uncountable amount of blood and represented their own innumerable losses. The dozens of branches were fighting over the source of the law of cold in the center. It seemed like the source of the law of cold contained something that they yearned for, but there was not much of it. Once other creatures obtained it, they would lose it, and what they were fighting over was precisely this existence. The layer of ice was extremely hard. Normally, even diamonds would be as fragile as tofu compared to this layer of ice. Of course, the creatures that existed in this hard layer of ice were not the kind of creatures that would be blocked by the ice in the layer of ice. Even though these living beings each had their own characteristics and advantages, they were essentially living beings that were similar to light. These creatures shuttled back and forth in the ice like ordinary creatures shuttling back and forth in the air. However, They were not blocked by the hardness of the ice at all. In fact, to these living beings, the frigid ice was their entire world. The normal space in the outside world, the air and the vital energy in the outside world were like the vacuum of the universe. They were completely repelled by the existence of the frigid ice. Meanwhile, the ground below them was like the end of the world, a barrier between the heavens and the earth. It was a place that they could not pass through at all. Just like that, creatures like Luo Fan, who could easily shuttle back and forth in this layer of ice in a way that they could not understand, entered the layer of ice with his physical body, but was not blocked by the layer of ice at all. Or rather, the layer of ice itself could not stop his existence at all. It was as if he was a creature that had charged into a certain world from the primal chaos. This shocked them greatly. It made them suddenly realize that there seemed to be a wider world outside of their world, and an even more unbelievable world for a time. Wherever Luo Fan passed, the battles gradually calmed down. Countless creatures began to follow behind Luo Fan, and they continuously followed him towards the deepest part of the ice field. They could sense that there was an existence that was filled with endless benefits for them, and they were constantly approaching it. Of course, some of these creatures were strong, and some were weak. Among them, there were very few who could truly catch up to Luo Fan, who could not be shaken off by Luo Fan, and who could truly advance towards their goal together with him. These creatures that were born, grew, fought, and died in the layer of ice clearly had a different worldview from all the creatures in the outside world. The world in their eyes, the Luo Fan in their eyes, and even the core of the ice field in their eyes were completely different from all the creatures in the outside world. To Luo Fan, he seemed to be heading in a straight line towards the deepest part, towards the source of the laws of ice. However, in the eyes of those creatures, Luo Fan's current route was crooked. Sometimes he would go forward, sometimes he would go backward, sometimes he would turn to the end of the world, sometimes he would rush out of the world, and sometimes he would re-enter the deepest part of the world. He was advancing in a way that they could not understand at all. Under these circumstances, even though they knew that the direction Luo Fan was heading and was extremely important and might even concern the survival of their entire world, there were only a few powerful creatures who could truly catch up to Luo Fan. Due to Luo Fan's method of advancing, more and more creatures were alarmed. They began to rush over from all directions from various battlefields, and followed behind Luo Fan with great difficulty. They followed Luo Fan deeper into the ice field. In other words, in their eyes, they were constantly going deeper into the world that they lived in. In the process, more and more creatures fell behind. In the end, only over 20 of the most powerful creatures from the 20 or so branches were left. They could still manage to follow behind Luo Fan and get closer to the source of the laws of ice. The source of the laws of ice was extremely beneficial to these creatures. If they were ordinary creatures of flesh and blood, they would have been frozen into ice and lost consciousness the moment they entered the layer of ice, as they could not grasp any extraordinary abilities. How could they get close to the source of the laws of ice? However, it was clear that they were not ordinary creatures of flesh and blood. They were a kind of living beings that were similar to light creatures. This form of creatures made them unaffected by the temperature. At the very least, they were not greatly affected by the temperature. At this moment, as they followed behind Luo Fan and sensed the increasingly shocking cold ahead, their bodies were being cleansed layer by layer. Each of them was continuously sublimated and strengthened as they advanced. The essence of the branch meridians that had been hidden in their bodies began to gradually emerge. After this essence emerged, their appearances began to differ more and more. Originally, due to the influence of the environmental characteristics of the icy plains outside, although these creatures developed from different branches and had different characteristics, their overall appearances were still very similar. After all, they had to adapt to the same environment. Naturally, they had to evolve similar characteristics in order to adapt to the environment and survive freely in such an environment. They could even grow and evolve further. However, as they continued to get closer to the source of the laws of ice, The various characteristics that were born from the environment on their bodies began to be gradually stripped away. The characteristics that were born from their essence began to be strengthened. This caused their appearances to gradually change, and they gradually became more and more different. In the beginning, it was still possible to see that they came from the same source and were the same kind of creatures. However, after they advanced with Luo Fan for a few days, they no longer had any similarities apart from the fact that they were similar to light creatures, that kind of strange posture, that kind of image that had nothing in common. Anyone who saw them would not be able to connect them together. However, these creatures were no longer in the mood to care about this. At this moment, all of their attention was placed on the incomprehensible and terrifying existence that came from beyond the world in front of them. They locked onto the traces that the existence left behind in the layers of worlds with great difficulty and followed these traces to move all over the world. They continuously shuttled back and forth, continuously venturing into the depths of the world. This matter had already taken up all of their attention. They did not even notice the changes in their bodies, and they even unknowingly forgot about the passage of time. Although it had only been a few days, they felt as if billions of trillions of years had passed. That long period of time even made them develop a state of mind that had experienced the vicissitudes of life. So there's actually such a vast place to go in the depths of the world. One day, a thought appeared in a certain creature's mind. With this thought, that creature suddenly felt his mind clear up. His originally hazy and muddled consciousness suddenly became clear. At this moment, he felt as if he had suddenly woken up from a boundless nightmare. Who am I? Where am I? What am I doing? These three questions surfaced in his mind at this moment. As these three questions arose, memories that he had spent tens of thousands of years in the past resurfaced and were reorganized by his new consciousness, allowing him to instantly understand countless things that he did not understand in the past. At the same time, he also saw his companions, or rather, his former enemies, who were following that incomprehensible creature into the depths of the world. In that instant, he saw many new gazes that were filled with doubt, realization, and endless curiosity sweeping over to him. At this moment, he understood that these enemies had also gained a clear consciousness. They had already broken away from chaos and their instincts. They had obtained the clear intelligence that a true intelligent creature should have. I've finally woken up. Who would have thought that I've been so muddle-headed all this time? A creature whose appearance was completely indistinguishable uttered the same sentiments that the other creatures wanted to express. At this moment, due to the cleansing of the origin of the cold laws, all the impurities in their bodies, hearts, and wills were cleansed. As a result, their bodies and minds had already broken away from the level of beasts and truly entered the level of intelligent creatures that could build a civilization. This change was equivalent to directly bestowing them with intelligence and giving their race the seed of a civilization. At this moment, every creature was overjoyed. They felt as if the entire world had changed. It had originally been extremely dangerous, but it had become extremely beautiful, making them extremely addicted. In this state, they forgot to lock onto the traces of that incomprehensible creature. Amidst their joy, they stopped at the depths of this level of the world. Chapter 2590. After gaining that understanding, he was no longer in a hurry to sink into the source of the cold law to absorb the endless laws within. The source of the cold law looked like a ball of cold air. In the boundless ice layer, there was no ice in the surrounding area. Instead, it was like a strange void with countless layers of space-time stacked within it. Here, space-time was in an extremely strange state. It seemed to be extremely chaotic, but it also seemed to follow some incomprehensible law. The changes seemed to be random, but it also seemed like there was an incomprehensible purpose in it. Under such circumstances, it seemed like any conjecture regarding the source of the cold law could be explained. However, no conjecture could truly explain the mysteries behind it. At this moment, the place where Luo Fan had already left the ice layer and was within the range of the space-time distortion. In other words, he was in an area that he had not encountered since entering the ice layer. It was an area that was not covered by ice. The many branch meridians were actually not completely in contact with the source of the cold law. In other words, they seemed to originate from the source of the cold law and seemed to be the convergence of the various principles and mysteries of the source of the cold law. However, in reality, there was no direct connection between them and the source of the cold law. At this moment, the many branch meridians originated from this area of the space-time distortion. All the branch meridians seemed to have been born out of thin air. They gathered together and eventually turned into an invisible river that extended beyond this area and into the ice layer. In the end, it meandered and flowed into the entire ice field like a huge network that enveloped the entire ice field. It even formed a strange ice world that gave birth to countless races. However, even if there was no direct connection like the roots and tree trunks, no one could deny that the branch meridians were connected to the source of the cold law. Even if this connection was unusual and different from what ordinary people understood, the existence of this connection could not be denied. To the source of the cold law, the coldness was not its core. The cold air that filled the entire ice field came from the source of the cold law. However, that was just like the source of the heat. Due to various coincidences, the cold aura had fused with the origin of the laws. In the end, the cold aura was strengthened by the origin of the laws, resulting in all sorts of unimaginable effects. In the end, this vast and boundless ice field was formed. For the song itself, the profoundness of the source of the rules wasn't coldness. In fact, the cold air was not really produced by the source of the cold laws. It could be said that if it wasn't cold chi that had appeared here, but a wave of heat instead, then the source of the laws before them would no longer be the source of the cold laws, but the source of the heat laws. Just like the heat law source that Luo Fan had previously obtained, since the origin of the rules had such a special characteristic, the connection between the branch meridians and the origin of the rules naturally didn't need to rely on the connection between the cold air. The connection between the two could be achieved through the nomological laws. Evidently, the rules and laws were omnipresent in every corner of the world. Under such circumstances, the origin of the rules seemed to have no direct connection with the branch meridians, but in essence, they were all attached to the nomological laws. In other words, they were enveloped by the nomological laws that permeated the entire world. In this way, they would naturally be tightly linked to each other through the laws and laws. Luo Fan naturally didn't care about this. In this distortion of space and time, he once again experienced the source of the heat law that he had previously obtained. He tried his best to understand the various principles and profoundness that were closely connected to the source of the cold law. After finding them, he tried his best to shatter them once again and experience them once more. He tried his best to study the principles hidden within and the profound meaning that he hadn't understood before. The reason why those principles and profoundness would go beyond his control and form a connection with some other source of the rules in the outside world was actually very simple. It was because his understanding of those principles and profoundness hadn't been completely thorough. Because he hadn't fully understood them, those principles and profoundness were still a hole. At least, a certain part of them was still a hole. In this hole, there was a hidden existence similar to a backdoor. This kind of backdoor could be triggered by certain changes in the outside world. In the end, it would go beyond his control and show some uncontrollable characteristics. Under such circumstances, the only way to prevent this kind of uncontrollable appearance was to shatter the hole and discover the existence similar to a backdoor. As long as he could do this, then all the changes produced by these principles and profoundness would be under his senses and even under his control. At that time, any changes could only be carried out within the scope that he allowed. In this way, the uncontrollable appearance that had just appeared would naturally no longer exist. And this was also what Luo Fan was doing now. At this moment, he was constantly trying to shatter the principles and profoundness that he had previously thought was the end. He was breaking down the deeper mysteries bit by bit and understanding the secrets within. He was trying his best to control the deeper principles and secrets within. As this continued, he felt that his understanding of the heat rule source was getting deeper and deeper. He even gradually discovered many things that he had previously neglected. Perhaps this is a never-ending process. Suddenly, this thought emerged from the bottom of his heart. However, as he continued to understand those principles and profoundness, he discovered that there was a content that far exceeded what he had previously thought. The more he realized that his understanding of those principles and profoundness was shallow. It seemed that these principles and profoundness could even be unearthed endlessly. This understanding corresponded with his current experience. When he had encountered this cold rule source, he hadn't discovered these deep contents. It only appeared after he had discovered this cold rule source. In that case, who could guarantee that the changes triggered by the source of the rule of cold were all that was contained within? Perhaps this was only a small part of it. Perhaps what he had discovered now, and what the cold rule source had stirred up, was only an insignificant small part of it. Perhaps when he had encountered more, bigger, and more mysterious rule sources in the future, they would be able to cause even more changes and even more situations that were beyond his control. However, although he had thought of this, Luo Fan didn't completely give up on the idea of these rule sources. After all, in this process of understanding and unearthing its contents, he was also constantly improving. Every time he unearthed a little bit of content, a little deeper truth, and a deeper profoundness, he would take another step forward. This was like obtaining a box that could take out food infinitely. No one would think that the box was abnormal just because it could take out food infinitely. This was fundamentally different from the true sage level principle. The principle of the true sage level could also be understood infinitely and could also be unearthed infinitely. However, that was because it was too profound and profound, far beyond the understanding of those who were below the true divine stage. That was why it was a situation like this. As for the understanding of the principle of this technique, no matter what, one could only get close to it but not truly obtain it. As such, for cultivators, it was naturally a heavy burden, a burden that they couldn't bear. For existences below the true sage level, there was naturally no need to understand this principle and this profoundness. However, the rule source in front of him was different. The principle and profoundness contained in the rule source itself wasn't something that Luo Fan couldn't understand. As long as he could discover all the principles and profoundness contained in it, he would definitely be able to understand it. Even if it could be unearthed infinitely, even if there was a deeper level to be discovered, no matter how deep one went, that was only because of the structure. It was because it had already used a method that Luo Fan couldn't understand to overlay the principles and profoundness that he could originally understand infinitely. Perhaps the overlaying method was a heavy burden to him, and it was something that he shouldn't have to understand. However, just the principles and profoundness themselves weren't. Obviously, what Luo Fan comprehended were those principles and profoundness. Therefore, to him, the rule source wasn't like the principles or aura of existences at the true sage level. It was a burden that needed to be abandoned and destroyed. Precisely because of this, at this moment, Luo Fan didn't completely abandon the principle just because he realized that it could be unearthed infinitely. Instead, he put in even more effort to understand the principles and profoundness and unearth the countless meanings within. As long as I'm not affected by the rule source of the cold, it means that I've already unearthed it to a sufficient depth. At least for now, it's already sufficient depth. As various thoughts flashed through his mind, Luo Fan finally understood what exactly he had to do next. At the same time, his desire to snatch the cold rule source, which was close to greed, had already disappeared. At this moment, he had already made a decision in his heart. He didn't need the cold rule source in front of him. In other words, to him, his original goal of regaining control over the heat rule source that he had already absorbed and digested was to ensure that it would not be affected by the cold rule source. This had become his final goal from being a transit point to a node. The reason for this was naturally because he suddenly understood that the origin of the ice laws was dispensable to him. If the heat rule source could be unearthed infinitely, then the principles and profoundness contained within would actually be limitless. Such principles and profoundness were clearly enough for him to comprehend. In this case, even if he obtained the cold rule source again, the principles and profoundness he obtained would only be a repetition of the previous ones. To him, the benefits would be minimal, and it could even be said that there was no benefit at all. It would only increase his workload. In this case, why would he need to obtain the cold rule source? After dispelling this greed, he suddenly realized that his entire body shook, and the slight feeling of being out of control suddenly skyrocketed. In the blink of an eye, it reached a level that was thousands of times stronger than when he had first arrived at the cold rule source. Meanwhile, the many profound truths and mysteries that he had already shattered and comprehended once again suddenly underwent new changes. It was as if some of the internal structures had surfaced and caught his attention. I've done the right thing. At this moment, how could Luo Fan not understand that he had already made the right decision? So, this is how the rule source is used. His view of the rule source had already undergone an earth-shattering change. Originally, he had treated the rule's source as food and nutrients. But now, he realized that the rule source was actually just a form of guidance. Any cultivator only needed to obtain one rule source to be considered to have obtained all of it. In the future, he might still need to find other rule source, but that would no longer be absorbing or seizing them. Instead, he would use the new rule source to stimulate the rule source that he had obtained. Through this stimulation, the deeper meaning and profoundness hidden within the rule source would be revealed, allowing the cultivator to comprehend it and absorb the rule source on a deeper level. And once the new rule source's stimulation of the original rule source ended, in other words, the cultivator's absorption of the original rule source would have improved to the point where he would be immune to the stimulation of a new rule source. That was when the cultivator would leave this rule source and head to another rule source in search of new stimulation. Chapter 2591. The source of the cold law in front of him was constantly emitting a boundless chill, causing Luo Fan to constantly circulate the heat in his body to withstand it. If he hadn't broken through, he definitely wouldn't be able to stay here for long in such a state. Every once in a while, he would have to leave this icy field and head to other areas to absorb heat to replenish the heat in his body. However, now that he had made a breakthrough, the situation was completely different. After his body broke through, his body had already stepped into the innate Grand Luo realm. The most obvious characteristic of an innate Grand Luo was that they were self-sufficient and didn't rely on external forces. This characteristic allowed the heat in his body to be born out of thin air according to his will. No matter how much he consumed, he could replenish it at any time. In this way, as long as the heat consumption rate wasn't too shocking, he could maintain this consumption rate forever. If it was before Luo Fan understood the true use of the source of the laws, he would have to go against the flow to resist the chill in the outside world. The amount of heat he needed to resist was tens or even hundreds of times more than the usual amount of heat. If that was the case, the rate of consumption would have already surpassed the rate at which his body could recover. If that was the case, he naturally wouldn't be able to hold on for too long. However, after he understood the true use of the source of the laws, a portion of the heat that was emitted from the source of the laws was naturally dispersed by the principles and profundities of the source of the laws. In that case, the amount of heat he needed to resist was reduced to a normal level. In fact, it was even less than the normal level. In that case, the rate of consumption was left behind by the recovery rate. This also meant that from now on, no matter how many years passed, even if it was for eternity, Luo Fan could stay here forever. He didn't need to leave this icy field to replenish his heat in the outside world. As long as he was willing, with such a change, staying near the source of the cold law naturally made Luo Fan feel less pressured. In the next 100 years, Luo Fan remained at his original position and didn't move at all as he experienced the source of the law of heat that he had absorbed into his body. Along with the experience of the past 100 years, he was more and more certain that his previous thoughts were correct. The principles and profundities contained in the source of these laws were indeed limitless. In the past 100 years, he felt that he had already dug a few hundred or even a few thousand levels into those principles and mysteries. However, even after digging to such a deep level, he still felt that there were countless layers hidden within. Behind it, within the principles and mysteries of the microscopic level that he had already deepened to the point where it was incomparably insignificant, to the point where even his perception could not reach, there were still more and more complicated levels hidden. As for why he could comprehend and dig deeper into the microscopic level that his senses could not reach, the reason was very simple. However, it was precisely because, at this moment, in front of him, was the source of the law of ice, which was already much closer to him. Due to the existence of the law of cold, the microscopic details were extremely active. This kind of activity caused these microscopic details to stand out from the endless microscopic bodies, and also caused the changes within them to be even more obvious. In the end, these microscopic bodies could be comprehended by him, and he could continue to shatter and absorb them. As for why he was now closer to the source of the law of cold than 100 years ago, it was even simpler. This was because the closer he was to the source of the law of cold, the greater the stimulation of the law of heat in his body. In the past 100 years, every few years, Luo Fan would feel that his research on the source of the law of heat had reached a certain limit. At this distance, the stimulation of the law of cold on the source of the law of heat had already reached its limit. If he did not get closer to the source of the law of cold, there would no longer be any meaning in staying here. Hence, he had no choice but to continue moving forward and get closer to the source of the law of cold. Just like this, he would get closer to the source of the law of cold every few years. Now, he was almost close to the source of the law of cold. However, the closer he got to the source of the law of cold, the coldness also became stronger. The consumption of heat in his body also became greater. If it was not for the fact that his absorption of the source of the law of heat had strengthened, causing his body to advance to the innate grand Luo level, and the amount of heat that his body could recover over time, the balance between the consumption and recovery of heat in his body would have been completely broken. If that was the case, he would have to find a time to leave this ice field and head to other places with heat to absorb heat to recover his body's consumption. However, although there was only a thin line between the source of the law of cold and the source of the law of cold, the coldness between the two was on two different levels. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was almost close to the source of the law of cold, could maintain the balance between the consumption and recovery of heat in his body, but it did not mean that he could still maintain the balance after entering the source of the law of cold. Hence, at this moment, Luo Fan did not feel that the stimulation of the law of cold on the source of the law of heat in his body was no longer effective. Instead, he directly stepped into the source of the law of cold. Instead, he was prepared to wait here for a period of time. At the very least, he had to accumulate enough heat in his body so that his body could last longer when the balance between the consumption and recovery of heat was broken. Staying here and waiting for the heat to accumulate bit by bit was naturally much faster than leaving this ice field and looking for a place like a volcano to absorb heat. After all, although his body could generate heat out of thin air as he willed, the heat that was generated still had to be eroded by the cold outside and was constantly being consumed. In fact, the speed at which the heat was generated was only slightly faster than the speed at which it was consumed. In this way, the time needed to accumulate the same amount of heat would probably be thousands or even tens of thousands of times slower than the outside world. However, there was an advantage to accumulating heat here. That was, the source of the law of cold still stimulated the source of the law of heat in his body to a certain extent. This stimulation was not enough for him to dig deeper into the source of the law of heat and to dig deeper truths and mysteries. However, it was enough for him to absorb the many truths and mysteries that he had dug out before. Absorbing and comprehending was not a one-time process. It was just like when Luo Fan had just stepped into the source of the law of cold. He immediately discovered that his body was faintly affected by the source of the law of cold, and everything that he had cultivated was faintly controlled by the source of the law of cold. At this time, Luo Fan did not dare to guarantee that he would not suffer the same fate when he encountered another source of the law of cold that was even more powerful and vast than the source of the law of cold. Therefore, at this time, he had to obediently absorb the various truths and mysteries that he had dug out before and turn them into nutrients for the growth of his worldview, his body, and his heat. Only then would he be able to avoid the predicament of encountering the source of the cold law. Of course, only by doing this could he truly absorb a part of the source of the law of heat and make it his own. If my cultivation realm recovers at this time, the great calamity will probably be greatly brought forward. Occasionally, such a thought would flash across Luo Fan's mind. This land of opportunity had a wonderful use. That was to suppress the great calamity. The great calamity that Luo Fan encountered was a kind of calamity that was born from the state of chaos because of his cultivation. The existence of this kind of calamity would constantly be brought forward as his cultivation realm increased. If he comprehended something that allowed his cultivation realm to increase beyond the limit, then even if the great calamity that he had originally sensed would arrive billions of years later, the great calamity might instantly arrive in the next moment. And obviously, for Luo Fan, the increase of his cultivation realm was actually closely related to the increase of his worldview. The increase of his worldview could very easily be converted into the increase of his cultivation realm. And the increase of his cultivation realm could also be converted into the sublimation of his worldview through some complicated changes. The two could almost be said to be 1 and 2, 2 and 1. And now, with the opportunity that he had obtained in this world, his worldview had already made great progress compared to 100 years ago. He didn't dare to say that he had improved by a level, but at least he had taken a huge step forward from his original level. Under such circumstances, if this was converted into the increase of his cultivation realm, the increase of his cultivation realm in the past 100 years would definitely be enough to greatly accelerate his 7th great calamity. Perhaps the original 300 million years of time would be directly surpassed by this increase, causing his 7th great calamity to descend in the next instant. But apparently that did not happen. The suppression of this world on transcendence and the suppression of the strength that he could unleash seemed to have affected the great calamity. In other words, during this suppression process, the great calamity's perception of him seemed to have weakened. This weakening made it so that no matter how much his view of the world had improved, no matter how much his cultivation had improved, the 7th great tribulation had completely ignored him. In the eyes of the 7th great calamity, he was still the same person that had stepped into this land of opportunity over 100 years ago. No matter how much he improved, the great calamity would not be brought forward. Because of this, at the very least, at this moment, Luo Fan felt that his 7th great calamity had only been reduced by a little over 100 years compared to the original. This was not much different from the time that he had entered this world. This situation, for Luo Fan, was a rare good thing. It could be said that this alone was enough for Luo Fan to put in so much effort to enter this land of opportunity. This way, I can also improve myself at will, and I don't need to worry about the great calamity being brought forward if I improve too much. This thought flashed through his mind, and a faint smile appeared on his face. Improving himself and the arrival of the great calamity, this was a contradiction. If he didn't improve himself, he wouldn't have much confidence in facing the great calamity. But once he improved himself, the great calamity would come forward, which in turn reduced the preparation time. The pros and cons could only be determined by the cultivator himself. In the past, Luo Fan didn't care about this at all. He only focused on improving himself and wholeheartedly focused on improving his cultivation realm as much as possible before the great calamity came. This method allowed him to improve to his current level in an extremely short period of time. One must know that under normal cultivator's cultivation, any cultivator who wanted to cultivate to Luo Fan's level would need at least 1 billion times more time than Luo Fan. Of course, This was because Luo Fan's path was different from theirs. However, it was obvious that the method that Luo Fan used to face the Great Calamity was also an important reason. It was precisely because Luo Fan didn't care about the time or the early arrival of the Great Calamity. He only focused on improving himself, and he was even happy because of the acceleration of time. That was why he was able to cultivate to his current level in such a short period of time. It was obvious that with his cultivation speed, his speed would still be many times faster than ordinary cultivators. At the very least, he didn't think that he would be stuck at the seventh tribulation like Taoist Wui and the others, who would need to spend billions of years to reach this level. However, this didn't mean that Luo Fan liked the feeling of having something constantly urging him behind his back. It was because he couldn't think of anything at all. After all, Luo Fan was a normal living being, a normal cultivator, and not a monster. Being able to relax and have a period of stability was something that he liked in the end. Chapter 2592. In this area, the absolute suppression of this land had also blinded the state of chaos. In this process of suppression, all his progress in the state of chaos was overshadowed by the state he was in before he entered this place. In other words, in the state of chaos, the current him was actually in a state where he was suppressed by this place. In other words, in the state of chaos, the current him was only a grand heavenly realm cultivator. This realm was naturally far from the state he was in before he entered this place, when he was at the peak of the sixth tribulation. In this way, any progress he made in this place would only strengthen his foundation at a lower level in the state of chaos. It wouldn't affect his upper limit at all, and naturally wouldn't bring forward the seventh tribulation that he would encounter. In this way, he would obviously have more time to strengthen himself and improve himself. Luo Fan stayed outside the source of the law of cold for 1,000 years. Previously, in order to feel the stimulation from the source of the law of cold for absorbing the law of heat, he only spent 100 years. But this time, in order to relive everything from before, he had spent 10 times more time than before. For Luo Fan, who would encounter the seventh tribulation in 300 million years, even 1,000 years was quite precious. Spending 1,000 years here seemed like a waste of time, and he didn't use this period of time as motivation to improve his cultivation realm. However, for Luo Fan, he didn't feel that this period of time was a waste. In his heart, he firmly believed that it was worth it to spend 1,000 years here. In fact, it could even be necessary. I've finally gotten rid of some of my impetuousness. On this day, Luo Fan thought to himself as he slowly stepped towards the source of the law of cold. After 1,000 years, the heat that he had accumulated had reached a level that he believed was enough to enter the source of the law of cold at this moment. In his body, in the heat circulation system, endless heat flowed around his body like a solid object. At every moment, various existences were produced from the depths of his body out of nowhere and continued to fuse with the heat. In fact, his worldview was also constantly fusing with his heat energy, allowing his heat energy to increase and sublimate at every moment, pushing his body to a higher level. The moment he came into contact with the source of the law of cold, an unimaginable chill came from his hand and instantly engulfed his entire body, causing his body to be completely frozen in an instant. His entire body was frozen in the ice. If it was an ordinary cultivator facing this change, even if they didn't die, they would still lose a layer of skin. However, for Luo Fan, who was already prepared, such a chill wasn't enough to move him. At this moment, there wasn't even any change in his expression because of this. Just the natural surge of heat in his body had completely vaporized the surrounding ice, allowing his body to quickly return to its original state. The chill was endless, and the heat in Luo Fan's body was endless as well, constantly fighting against the chill. At this moment, he clearly felt that the source of the law of heat in his body had received an intense stimulation that it had never experienced before. The microscopic individual that had been separated to the limits of his senses now revealed its existence in an unprecedented manner, allowing Luo Fan to clearly discover its existence even if he didn't focus. As expected, the stimulation is many times stronger than before. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he no longer hesitated and took a step forward, completely stepping into the source of the law of cold. As he stepped in, the source of the law of cold started to tremble slightly, and circles of ripples were continuously released on its surface. The source of the law of cold was the source of the entire ice field. Even though the source of the law of cold itself didn't have much to do with the cold, because of its combination with the chill here, it naturally increased the chill, causing it to become the source of the entire ice field. Under such circumstances, the source of the law of cold had a huge impact, but it didn't just affect the source itself. Instead, it spread out and directly affected the entire ice field, causing the entire ice field to undergo an earth-shattering change in an instant. At this moment, cracking sounds could be heard from all over the ice field. Countless cracks seemed to suddenly appear in the ice field out of nowhere, but they quickly closed up due to the chill in the ice field. This change made the originally extremely calm ice field seem to instantly become noisy and lively. It felt like the entire ice field was a living creature that was currently in a deep sleep and was currently turning over. However, this was the extent of the changes to the entire ice field. After all, apart from the cold ice, there was actually nothing else in the ice field. Under such circumstances, as long as the changes to the ice field didn't cause the entire ice field to collapse and shrink or expand, the changes to the ice field wouldn't cause too much of an impact. Therefore, even though the ice field trembled a few times and rattling sounds echoed throughout the ice field, that was all there was to it. However, there weren't any obvious changes in the outside world because of this. In fact, if one was a little further away, they wouldn't even be able to sense the changes. However, this was only in the outside world. To the inside of the ice field, the impact of this change was earth-shattering. It should be known that the ice field seemed to be empty at first glance, with only the existence of the cold. However, in reality, due to the influence of the source of the law of cold, there were many strange living creatures in the ice field. These living creatures viewed the entire ice field from a completely different perspective from ordinary living creatures. To them, the ice field was their universe, it was their world, it was their land, and it was their space-time. At this moment, the continuous cracking and mending of the ice field appeared everywhere. To them, it was as if the myriad of worlds had started to undergo shocking changes. The world was cracking, the earth was dying and being born again, the universe was shifting, and the starry sky was changing shape. Everything made them feel as if the entire world was becoming completely different from before at every single moment. Due to these changes, countless living creatures had perished on the first day, and countless worlds that ordinary living creatures were familiar with had disappeared without a trace. However, at the same time, countless strange living creatures were born out of thin air. There were also countless strange worlds that were born out of thin air. These various changes even made the knowledgeable living creatures wonder if the original development of billions of years had been compressed into a few days. That's right, some knowledgeable living creatures had already appeared in the various worlds within the ice field. Ever since the living creatures that had chased after Luo Fan and headed toward the source of the law of cold returned to those worlds, these living creatures had already been born. Back then, those living creatures had chased after Luo Fan and continuously ventured deeper into the ice field, continuously approaching the source of the law of cold. In the end, due to various factors, whether inevitable or accidental, some sort of barrier over their hearts was removed, allowing them to obtain true intelligence. And from then on, they became truly intelligent living creatures. However, at the same time, they had also lost track of Luo Fan and no longer knew where to continue chasing after Luo Fan deep into the ice field. Thus, after that, they had all returned to their own ice worlds. After returning to those worlds, due to some extremely mysterious mechanism, the intelligence they obtained began to gradually influence more and more other living creatures. This allowed those living creatures that were already on the verge of developing true intelligence to truly open the final barrier and obtain true intelligence. As this intelligence was obtained, the battles between the various worlds, or perhaps the various races, naturally weaken a lot. After all, the original reason why the battles were so intense was actually because the living creatures that participated in the battles were controlled by their instincts. After obtaining true intelligence, although their instincts did not disappear, they could already be suppressed by intelligence and rationality. With this suppression, they would naturally weigh the pros and cons of the battles, and would naturally weigh whether it was necessary for them to fight and to what extent they could accept it. With this consideration, the scale of the battles naturally began to change. After the scale of the battles changed, those worlds naturally had more time and more opportunities to develop. In the end, in the thousands of years that Luo fans saw, and in the hundreds of thousands of years that they saw, they had already completely changed the situation of those worlds, allowing those so-called worlds to truly have the taste of a world, and also allowing those worlds to give birth to real civilizations. It was precisely because of this that when faced with the current disaster, those worlds' performance was much better than expected. At the very least, it was much better than when the disasters happened in the past. Although this kind of disaster did not happen often, the icy plains had existed for countless years, and changes were bound to happen. Once the icy plains changed, for the living creatures that lived in the icy plains, it was equivalent to a change in the infinite worlds, and the impact would definitely not be much less than this time. In the past, almost every time the icy plains changed, it would be enough to cause a great collapse of the living creatures. Every time, the original embryonic civilization would be destroyed, and it would be completely unsalvageable. After all, in the past, those living creatures were more controlled by instincts. They would not measure how the changes would affect their future. They only knew that they would be fine, but their enemies would almost die. Therefore, they would choose to directly attack their enemies, making things worse for them, and died a violent death after that. When they were about to die, other living creatures would naturally treat them as targets and directly attack them. In this endless cycle, the vast majority of living beings would die within it in the end. If almost all living creatures were dead, how could there be any embryonic civilization? But now, the situation was completely different. Living creatures with intelligence and civilization would naturally measure the scale of the changes, and would naturally consider how they could maintain their own civilization as much as possible. Therefore, things like helping each other, which would have been impossible in the past, would naturally appear between these civilizations. Once they helped each other, the possibility of a civilization being able to continue would naturally increase greatly. One day, a living creature that had chased after Luo Fan towards the origin of the laws of frost made this judgment. The changes this time are very different from before. It feels more like a new race is being born. This living creature was the first among the living creatures in the icy plains to gain intelligence, and could be said to be the so-called ancestors of wisdom in the infinite worlds. As such, he naturally had an extremely transcendent status. Because they were from the same batch of people who had gained wisdom, they no longer hated their mortal enemies. Instead, their relationship with each other was in a rather complicated state. They were repelling each other, but also friendly at the same time. At this moment, his words were directed to the ancestors of wisdom in other worlds through the icy plains. Very similar. Moreover, I sensed a rather familiar aura from it. Another ancestor of wisdom responded at this moment. You sense it too? I thought it was just my imagination, another ancestor of wisdom said. His voice was filled with shock and disbelief, as if what he had just heard was inconceivable to him as well. If even the two of you feel this way, then it's almost certain. This change must have been caused by that foreign object. Another ancestor of wisdom made his judgment at this moment. That should be the case. The other progenitors of wisdom all agreed. To these ancestors of wisdom, in the infinite worlds, they were the only existences that could communicate with each other. To them, all other living creatures were merely juniors. To them, they were far, far too stupid. Therefore, they communicated with each other in this manner and made decisions together regarding important matters in the infinite worlds. Naturally, there are all sorts of schemes and all sorts of battles. There is no need to mention them. To a certain extent, this kind of communication. Chapter 2593. Following the actions of the wisdom ancestors, the entire ice field began to squirm. The terrifying changes that had been suppressed reappeared at this moment. However, the terrifying power seemed to be guided by some unimaginable existence. Although it was still causing all sorts of destruction to those worlds, at the same time, it was also pushing those worlds to converge towards the center. These worlds were formed because of the many branches that extended from the source of the cold rule. The changes in these worlds would naturally affect those branches. At this moment, with the push of the changes, those worlds began to converge toward a certain center. However, it also gradually affected those branches that had originally extended in all directions. As a result, those branches also began to change directions and began to converge towards the center along with those worlds. Compared to the changes in the original myriad heavens and realms, this change was quite huge. The changes in the worlds could be said to be changes in the perspective of those living beings. For the ice field in reality, this was at most a slight change in the circulation of the cold air. However, at this moment, the changes caused by these branches were unbelievably huge. It should be known that these branches were like the entire ice field. They were extended from the source of the cold rule. In this way, the changes in these branches could be said to be the changes in the entire ice field. Along with this change, all the ice in the entire ice field seemed to have begun to flow. An unknown amount of terrifying power was continuously accumulating, releasing, accumulating, and releasing. In the end, a strange rumbling sound came from the entire ice field. Even the originally calm surface of the ice field began to undulate strangely. Amidst these strange undulations, the ice in the ice field splashed everywhere. Icebergs even rose from the ice field, and basins suddenly appeared. It was as if there was an invisible hand that was casually reshaping the entire ice field. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan, who was in the depths of the ice field, didn't feel anything. At this moment, he was wholeheartedly experiencing the stimulation of the source of the cold rule on the source of the heat rule in his body. He felt more and more details of the source of the cold rule in his body that he couldn't sense before resurfacing in the corner of his attention. It displayed an increasingly strong sense of existence in front of him. It displayed all sorts of mysterious principles and mysteries without reservation, allowing him to shatter it bit by bit and fuse it into his worldview, into his body, and into the heat in his body. At this time, in the heat cycle in his body, there was an endless amount of heat being rapidly consumed at every moment. But even so, his body still felt waves of cold. But even with such a large amount of energy consumed, he still couldn't completely block the boundless chill that was being released from the source of the law of ice. His entire body trembled under the chill, and he couldn't help using his instincts to resist the chill. Fortunately, he had accumulated enough heat in the past 1,000 years, and he was able to completely resist this pressure. Otherwise, just the pressure formed by this kind of cold would have been enough to tie up all of his mental strength. At that time, how would he still have the mood to comprehend the various principles and mysteries that he had previously ignored that had resurfaced in the source of the heat rule? But even so, he felt that his efficiency in comprehending those principles and mysteries had greatly decreased. Although his comprehension efficiency was much higher than when he was outside at the last moment, it was still many times worse than when he first sensed the stimulation of the source of the cold rule. Luo Fan was naturally dissatisfied with this situation, but it was obvious that this wasn't something he could change. Cultivation had its own rules. At a low level, as long as one comprehended a little, there would be a huge improvement and earth-shattering changes. However, the higher one cultivated, the slower one's cultivation speed would be. As time passed and one's level increased, one would encounter a bottleneck after reaching a certain level. No matter how one cultivated, one would not be able to improve further. And now, Luo Fan had clearly fallen into a state where his cultivation speed had slowed down. This kind of situation was much slower than before, but it was still many times better than the state of being stuck in a bottleneck. Therefore, even if he wasn't satisfied with his cultivation speed, he could only obediently accept it. Now, all he could do was patiently wait, patiently cultivate, and rely on his spirit to absorb the benefits brought by the stimulation bit by bit. For Luo Fan, he had already fallen into a peaceful state of cultivation for a long time. Everything else had nothing to do with him. However, for the living beings in the ice field, the world would undergo drastic changes. The world would find its balance again, and it would be the juncture where the worlds would be destroyed and reborn. If they could withstand it, then the worlds would welcome a new life. If they couldn't, then all the worlds in the universe would perish. All the civilizations and living beings in the universe, even the ancestors of wisdom, would perish as a result. Faced with such a situation, the wisdom ancestors were naturally extremely careful. In fact, he was already faintly becoming anxious. They had already guessed that it would be extremely difficult to unify the worlds and reform them into a complete world. However, when they actually carried out the task, they realized that it was not just difficult at all. It was an almost impossible task. Before this, they were worried that the other wisdom ancestors would take advantage of this opportunity to harm them. But when they actually carried out the task, they realized that they were just worrying for nothing. At this juncture, where the worlds would be destroyed and all living beings and civilizations would perish, how antisocial would they have to be to plot against their companions? It must be known that this wasn't just the deaths of others, but their own deaths. They were confident that the enmity and conflict between them and the others had not reached the point where they had to perish together with them. Therefore, it could be said that they understood that their next enemy was actually the power that was obstructing the convergence of the worlds, and not the other ancestors of wisdom. Origin energy is indeed violent. If we hadn't comprehended many of its profundities over the years, I'm afraid that the worlds would have perished by now, one of the wisdom ancestors said with difficulty. Don't be distracted at this time, another wisdom ancestor said. Following that, the wisdom ancestor who spoke first said, "This isn't being distracted. This is unifying our thoughts." The other wisdom ancestors only faintly smiled and did not reply to his words. They also knew the wisdom ancestor's intentions, but they didn't agree with it. The wisdom ancestor clearly wanted to make sure that everyone else had the same thoughts as him, so he clearly explained the risks of the plan that they were carrying out. But to the other wisdom ancestors, there was no need to say anything at all. At this time, they no longer had any thoughts of being on guard against others, nor did they have any thoughts of dealing with others. They believed that virtually all of the wisdom ancestors knew this attitude. Their way of thinking and their views would be the same. Under such circumstances, the wisdom ancestor said these words in order to unify everyone's thoughts and confirm that everyone had the same thoughts as him. This obviously meant that he himself was actually the one who didn't trust others the most. In other words, he still held a certain level of vigilance towards others. Because of this, they naturally didn't have any thoughts of paying attention to the wisdom ancestor who was so suspicious. If it wasn't for the fact that the situation was too grim and the worlds might perish if they weren't careful, the wisdom ancestor might have already started to look down on him. The wisdom ancestor didn't care about the attitudes of the other wisdom ancestors at all. He was already able to confirm his thoughts from the attitudes of the other wisdom ancestors and knew their mentality. He understood that he no longer needed to be on guard against the other wisdom ancestors. As he realized this, he was finally able to wholeheartedly devote himself to the promotion of the myriad heavens realms. A few days ago, the wisdom ancestor had also started to put in effort during this process and had also started to pour all of his attention into it. As they changed, the movement of the worlds became more and more stable, and the number of worlds that perished due to the movement also started to decrease. From a certain point of view, the words of the wisdom ancestor had actually achieved his goal. If it hadn't been for these words, it would have taken some time for them to unify their thoughts. If that was the case, there might be several worlds in the universe that would perish because of this While the wisdom ancestors were constantly pushing the multiverse world, all sorts of changes were taking place outside the multiverse world. Outside of the myriad heavens and realms was still within the scope of the tundra ice field. In other words, it meant that there was another area within the ice field that was different from the worlds outside. One world after another was gradually forming in that region. Or rather, it couldn't be said to be a single area, but rather a large area. That area was like a halo that enveloped all the worlds in the universe. As the worlds in the universe shrank, it began to expand. What's going on? The wisdom ancestors were all indescribably shocked when they sensed this. Exclamations of bewilderment rang out from all over the worlds, reverberating in everyone's ears. These worlds aren't our worlds. At this moment, another wisdom ancestor with sharper senses said with an ugly expression on his face, "That's right. I can't control those worlds at all. Even my perception can't penetrate those worlds." Another wisdom ancestor said in an extremely solemn voice, "I've sensed a little more." At this moment, another wisdom ancestor spoke up. When the other wisdom ancestors heard this, their expressions changed slightly, and they all asked him what he had sensed. The otherworldly alternate entity. I sensed the aura of the otherworldly alternate entity within it. The wisdom ancestor didn't keep them in suspense, and at this moment, he directly told them what he had sensed. These words contained an incomparably heavy and shocked emotion. Hearing this voice, one could instantly understand how heavy and shocked the person who spoke was at this moment. The otherworldly alternate entity. Are you sure you didn't sense wrongly? The other wisdom ancestors all exclaimed at this moment. Although they had already sensed the aura of the otherworldly alternate entity when the ice field had changed previously, at that time, they had only thought that the otherworldly alternate entity was using some method to destroy the ice field, or perhaps to destroy the source of the worlds. However, at this moment, they actually sensed the aura of the otherworldly alternate entity in the newly born world. Didn't this mean that the otherworldly alternate entity wasn't just destroying things? Could it be that he wanted to replace all the heavens and myriad realms and make them his? At this moment, horrifying thoughts appeared in the hearts of all the wisdom ancestors, causing their expressions to become even more unsightly. To them, this world was only as big as the myriad heavens and realms. To them, everything outside the ice field was in a state of chaos, just like to Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, their gazes were naturally limited to this area. To them, the myriad worlds were everything, and its preciousness could suppress everything they knew. In this way, the otherworldly alternate entity wanted to turn everything into its own. It wanted to take everything for itself, which was why they were so shocked. Amidst this shock, they even relaxed their control over the otherworldly alternate entity. Just that one moment of relaxation had caused thousands of worlds to perish. Chapter 2594. No matter what the other party wants to do, protecting our people and protecting our civilization is our most important mission. We'll talk about everything else when we're free. One of the wisdom ancestors shouted. Following this shout, the other wisdom progenitors responded in unison. This wasn't because they felt that the wisdom ancestor who had shouted had a higher status than them, but because they agreed with what the wisdom ancestor had said. Although their current intelligence had surpassed that of their people and all living beings in their civilization, they were still far more intelligent than them. However, their roots were still in the clansmen that they were superior to. If it weren't for them, these wisdom ancestors would only be relatively powerful, ordinary living beings in this universe. How could they be called Tao ancestors? Moreover, without their roots, they would become isolated people. They would lose their homes and motivation. It would be normal for them to become wandering ghosts. Under such circumstances, they naturally couldn't let this happen. But his feelings for his people and his civilization were extremely passionate and intense. This was especially so now. Because of their mistakes, they had caused many worlds to collapse, many civilizations to be destroyed, and many living beings to perish. This sense of guilt caused the emotions hidden in the depths of their hearts to surface once again. They began to occupy their minds, causing them to become emotional. It was precisely because of this that they agreed so solemnly. However, the wisdom ancestor who shouted did not feel proud because of this. At this time, he was also extremely solemn. Those words weren't only said to the other wisdom ancestors, but also to himself. These words were also to remind himself not to forget his roots, not to forget his dependence, and not to forget his feelings. With such a mentality, how could he be complacent because of the stern reply of the other wisdom ancestors? As the many wisdom ancestors shifted their attention from the outside world, the universe stabilized again and began to slowly shrink inward like before. They slowly approached each other and gradually glued together. Outside of the multiverse, in another region of the ice field, countless tiny worlds were born and gradually replaced the original multiverse. They gradually occupied the region where the original multiverse was and filled those regions with worlds, causing the situation in the ice field to be the same as before. Faced with this situation, although the wisdom ancestors noticed it, they had already made up their minds, so they no longer cared about the changes in the situation. At this moment, even if the many worlds in the outside world continued to be born and occupied the area they gave up, they only focused on pushing the universe that they could influence. They focused on controlling the source power that filled the universe, which was like the source power of the universe, and constantly pushed the universe toward the center. Under this change, the living beings in the universe suddenly felt that the world seemed to have become stable again. Moreover, the doomsday-like danger that permeated their hearts had completely disappeared at this moment. What replaced it was an indescribable sense of warmth and stability. It was as if some incomparably huge and mighty existence was embracing them with its chest, giving them enough warmth and enough safety. That feeling made all the living beings feel satisfied, and it was to the point that the chaos caused by the changes from before had unknowingly calmed down. Outside the multiverse, the worlds that had filled up the space that the multiverse had made way for continued to fill up those areas and began to communicate with each other. Vaguely, they also began to communicate with the tundra. Gradually, they absorbed all sorts of indescribable things from the tundra. Gradually, these worlds began to grow, and vaguely, they began to connect as one, displaying some sort of extraordinary unity. Unknowingly, many living beings were born in these worlds. These living beings that were born from those worlds were extremely mysterious. Within those living beings, one could sense an aura that belonged to the universe, as well as an aura that belonged to the otherworldly oddity. Moreover, the aura of the universe was not limited to the aura of the living beings in the civilizations that were born under the influence of any of the branches. Instead, it included the aura of the living beings in the civilizations that were born under the influence of all the branches in the universe. It felt like these countless worlds were born from the fusion of the myriad heavens and realms, and then fused with a certain existence brought by the otherworldly alternate entity. At this moment, the branches began to undergo all sorts of subtle changes. It was originally like the convergence of a river, but at this moment, there were wisps of thin branches that were born from the branches. Like a network, they communicated with each other and formed one, enveloping the many worlds outside. During this process, the aura belonging to the otherworldly oddities in those worlds also began to move. They began to automatically guide the branch veins, taking advantage of the branch veins to continuously absorb, and gather. At this moment, the branch veins seemed to have become the source of power. They began to continuously inject energy into those worlds, causing them to continuously grow and sublimate. In the end, they became more and more powerful, larger and larger, and the creatures within them also became more and more complex and numerous. In the end, there were even signs of them forming a civilization. Compared to the myriad worlds in the universe that needed the wisdom ancestor to light up its wisdom and let it spread, The living beings in these newly born worlds were naturally polarized. Those that possessed wisdom had seeds of wisdom from the beginning and did not need the wisdom ancestor to light them up and spread their wisdom. As they grew, they would naturally be able to possess perfect and even powerful wisdom. On the other hand, most of the living beings were born without the seeds of wisdom. No matter how they grew and sublimated, they could only evolve at the level without wisdom. Under this polarized situation, those worlds were extremely lively. Those without wisdom naturally rejected those with the seeds of wisdom. Although they did not have wisdom, they had instincts and intuitions. This instinct and intuition caused them to abhor those who possessed the seeds of wisdom and could grow into intelligent beings or even create civilizations. Once they sensed their existence, they would pounce on them and fight them to the death. They were even willing to perish together in order to kill them. In the face of such a situation, those with the seeds of wisdom felt unimaginable pressure. This pressure made them use all means to sublimate themselves, improve themselves, and evolve themselves. Under such circumstances, they began to rapidly mature, and the seeds of wisdom hidden in their bodies began to grow and strengthen at an unimaginable speed. As they grew and strengthened, those living beings became smarter and smarter. As they became smarter, they naturally turned from a disadvantage to an advantage over those without the seeds of wisdom, and their original defensive stance turned into an offensive stance. Those without the seeds of wisdom gradually became the hunting targets of those who had already become intelligent beings, and they became resources for their growth. Just like that, the embryonic form of civilization began to appear. Due to the existence of those living beings without the seeds of wisdom as external enemies, the embryonic form of civilization endured unimaginable pressure as soon as it appeared, and it grew at an unimaginable speed. In just a few dozen days in the outside world, but in the eyes of the living beings in those worlds within the ice plains after thousands of years, the embryonic form of civilization in those worlds finally fully matured and became true civilizations. With the emergence of true civilizations, the potential of those living beings in those worlds began to increase at an unimaginable speed. Those worlds that were originally separated also began to connect at an unimaginable speed. As they connected, a new universe appeared in the minds of those living beings. Compared to the previous universe, it was clear that this new universe was more suitable for the living beings in the worlds that had been affected by the otherworldly organisms. Those creatures could sense endless principles and profundities within it. There was also a hint of coldness that transcended the myriad worlds in the universe. In this way, for those living beings, expansion was the only thing they could do. After all, the more they expanded, the more resources they could obtain, and the richer the principles and mysteries they could obtain would be. In this way, how could those living beings who had already tasted this benefit give up on it? In this way, a new war broke out. Compared to the old war between the universes in the past, with the guidance of the ancestor of wisdom, the scale of the war did not exceed the limits of the world. This new universe did not have the existence of such a transcendent ancestor of wisdom. All actions could only be decided by the numerous living beings in the new heavens and realms themselves. For these living beings, their thirst for resources, their thirst for principles and mysteries was not something that ordinary living beings could compare to. At the very least, it was not something that the living beings in the old universe could compare to. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine what the war caused by those living beings would be like. Unknowingly, the worlds had entered a state of war. Moreover, from time to time, there would be worlds that would be destroyed, shattered, and perished because of this war. If it weren't for the fact that the ice field was still changing at every moment, with countless worlds being born at every moment to make up for the gap formed after the old worlds gave way to the ice field wouldn't have been able to withstand the changes. Otherwise, a war of this scale would have wiped out all the worlds in the ice field in just a few months. Not only would it include the new universes, but it might even include all the living beings and existences in the old universes. If that was the case, the entire ice field would have fallen into a state of deathly stillness. But even so, the wisdom ancestors were still trembling with fear as they watched this scene. Although the wisdom ancestors were wholeheartedly pushing the old universes, wanting them to completely merge and become one, the changes in the outside world, with so many worlds constantly being born and dying, how could they not care? How could they not know? Therefore, when those worlds fell into war, they had already diverted some of their attention to the new universes. And when they clearly saw how the war in the new universes was carried out, they began to be shocked again and again. The living beings in the new universes did not have existences like the wisdom ancestor to guide them. Therefore, their cultivation methods, in comparison, had many weaknesses, flaws, and crudeness. Purely in terms of perfection, their cultivation methods were actually far inferior to the living beings in the old universes that were guided by the wisdom ancestor. However, this kind of relatively bad thing could actually be regarded as a good thing, apart from anything else, because they were no longer restricted by the wisdom ancestor. Their cultivation methods were like 100 schools of thought contending for supremacy. Almost every cultivation method, every possible cultivation train of thought, could be found in the new myriad heavens and realms. Moreover, because there were no restrictions and guidance from the wisdom ancestor, the destructive power that they developed was even more bizarre. Killing seemed to be the most ordinary method to destroy the enemy in the new universes. Apart from that, there were all sorts of methods that even the wisdom ancestor could not help but tremble at the sight of, such as eliminating one's sense of existence, reversing cause and effect, turning enemies into friends, distorting minds, and so on. In this way, in the eyes of the wisdom ancestors, the new universes were simply a world of monsters. Chapter 2595. The development speed of the new multiverse was rather fast. Battles gave the new multiverse a powerful impetus, causing the living beings to put all their wisdom and thoughts into developing themselves and their own worlds. In the end, the survival of the fittest in the battles allowed the civilizations of those worlds to constantly sublimate and improve, and it also led the other worlds to continuously sublimate and improve. There were naturally victories and defeats in battles. The victorious ones absorbed the resources of other worlds, nurtured themselves, and allowed their own worlds to constantly grow. However, those who failed didn't just fall into the mud. Failure was a kind of experience, and in a broad sense, it could even be considered a kind of wealth. Under such circumstances, the defeated worlds didn't just fall into despair. Instead, they turned their grief and indignation into strength, gathering the power of the world, and worked hard to cultivate and strengthen themselves in order to be able to turn the tables in the next battle and reverse the fate of failure. In this way, although the speed of development was much slower than the victorious worlds, it was still constantly moving forward and climbing to a higher level. Under such circumstances, the worlds constantly transitioned and constantly sublimated. Perhaps this speed of development was ordinary for the living beings in the new multiverse, and many living beings were even rather dissatisfied with this development. However, for the ancestors of wisdom in the old multiverse, this speed was already extremely terrifying. Each and every one of them was dumbfounded and terrified. They were terrified of this unimaginable speed of development, and they were terrified of when they would discover the old heavens and realms and reach into the old heavens and realms. With this speed of development, the new multiverse had developed all sorts of cultivation methods and unbelievable battle techniques. Their worlds simply couldn't resist at all. It was the same even if they, the forefathers of wisdom, existed in the old heavens and the myriad of worlds. Not to mention that they, the ancestors of wisdom, couldn't spare a hand at all. They needed to constantly exert all their efforts to maintain the oppression and pressure on the new multiverse to prevent these worlds from rebounding again. If they were to be discovered by the rebounding forces, then the rebounding force alone would be enough to destroy more than half of the old multiverse. Not to mention, The worlds that were bounced back would directly collide with the new heavens and realms. At that time, just the collision alone would be enough to destroy more than half of the remaining worlds. In the end, even the most arrogant ancestor of wisdom would never think of using the little bit of the world that was left to deal with the entire new universe. Under such circumstances, they could only pray that the new beings in the multiverse didn't discover them. No one knew if their prayers worked or if there were other reasons. The living beings in the new heavens and realms only focused their attention on the numerous worlds within the new heavens and realms. He didn't seem to have much interest in the outside world. Or perhaps they didn't even know that there were other heavens and realms outside of their own. Faced with this situation, the wisdom ancestors naturally heaved a sigh of relief. However, it was impossible for him to let his guard down. They were only trying their best to speed up the fusion process. As long as they fused, the other benefits were secondary. The most important thing was that they would be able to free up their hands to deal with the threat of the new multiverse. Amidst this uneasiness and worry, the distance between the old multiverse began to shrink gradually. In the end, after thousands of years, the collision finally occurred. In other words, the distance between the many worlds in the old multiverse had finally shrunk to the point where some worlds began to come into contact with each other. Boom, 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 boom. Strange rumbles instantly spread to every corner of the old heavens and realms, causing all living beings to look in all directions towards the source of the rumbles. In other words, they were looking at the place where the worlds in the old multiverse came into contact with each other. Of course, only a very small portion of the living beings could truly see the collision of worlds and come into contact with each other. Most of the living beings could only look in the direction where the sound came from. Vaguely, they could only be sure that some kind of shocking upheaval was taking place in that direction, but they had no idea what exactly was happening and what impact it would have on them. For the entire ice field, this change wasn't a tremor, nor was it a terrifying sound. Instead, it was just a flash of light that suddenly appeared somewhere. These flashes were as if a flash had been switched on, or as if some kind of camera was taking photos in the depths of the ice field. Faced with this situation, the entire ice field naturally didn't change because of this. It seemed that the ice field was still the same as before, maintaining the same frequency of changes, as if nothing had happened. It was obvious that this situation vividly displayed the difference between the so-called worlds in the universe and the real icy plains. On the other hand, the influence of this change was not only limited to the old worlds in the ice plains. For the ice field, this change was just a flash of light, but for the interior of the ice field, for the world that was almost composed of light, this change was really earth-shattering. At this moment, hearing this sound, the living beings in the new multiverse knew that this terrifying change was not limited to the living beings in the old multiverse, but also included the living beings in the new multiverse. When the rumbling sound spread in the new multiverse, countless living beings raised their eyes from what they were doing and looked in the direction where the sound came from. Of course, compared to the old multiverse, where only 1% of the living beings in 10 who were looking in that direction could see where the change was and what exactly was happening, the number of living beings in the new multiverse who could see these changes was countless times fewer than the living beings in the old multiverse. If a ratio had to be used, perhaps only 1 in 100 million of the creatures looking in that direction would be able to clearly see what was happening in that area. The reason for this was naturally not because the living beings in the old multiverse were much more powerful than the living beings in the new multiverse. Instead, it was because the new multiverse was much further away than the place where the change was happening. Don't forget that the change and the collision happened in the old multiverse. In other words, it was equivalent to the group of worlds that those living beings lived in. Under such circumstances, if one looked at it from a macro perspective, it was as if it was happening right next to them. However, compared to the new multiverse, the place where the change happened was in another group of worlds that was extremely far away from them, and the living beings here couldn't discover it at all. Under such circumstances, It was already extremely rare for a living being to be able to see the source of the changes under the guidance of the voice. How could they ask for more? Of course, this was also because the living beings in the new multiverse had a rich cultivation path, and there were many cultivation methods that greatly improved their observational skills. If it wasn't for this advantage, and if they were like the old worlds, where almost all the cultivation methods and cultivation systems were cultivated according to the methods passed down by the wisdom ancestor, the chances of this happening would be even lower. It was even to the extent that no living being would be able to discover the source of the change and the existence of another group of worlds. However, all these ifs and what-ifs obviously didn't happen. The current reality was that the living beings in the new multiverse had discovered the old multiverse. Damn it, the hearts of the wisdom ancestors almost skipped a few beats. All of them cursed in their hearts. The secret that they had guarded for thousands of years was actually exposed in such a ridiculous way. How could they not be angry? What do we do now? This is the most critical moment for the fusion of the multiverse. We can't spare any effort at all. Another wisdom ancestor asked the others angrily. He couldn't think of any solutions at this point. All he could hope for now was that the others could think of some good ways to deal with this situation. However, it was clear that all of the wisdom ancestors had communicated with each other for so many years, and they had already absorbed each other's strengths. At this moment, all of the wisdom ancestors' wisdom was actually on the same level. Under such circumstances, if one wisdom ancestor couldn't think of something, the other wisdom ancestors naturally wouldn't be able to think of anything either. Therefore, the reply he received was silence. All of the wisdom ancestors were constantly thinking about what to do, but in the end, none of them could come up with an effective solution. If we weren't in such a hurry, perhaps we could think of a way, but now. One of the wisdom ancestors sighed. Let's not think too much for now. The most important thing now is to fuse the worlds. As long as the worlds fuse successfully, we can split our attention to do other things. If the worlds don't fuse successfully, the multiverse will be finished, and there's even less of a need to think about other things, one of the wisdom ancestors said. Hearing this, another wisdom ancestor said, "That's right, if we can't split our attention, even if we think of a perfect solution, we can't execute it." Hearing these words, the wisdom ancestors unified their thoughts and began to put the matter of the multiverse being discovered to the back of their minds. They continued to work hard to push for the continuous fusion of the multiverse. Just as they had said, this was an extremely crucial moment. This was because the multiverse had truly begun to fuse. What would the multiverse look like after the fusion? How many worlds would be destroyed in the process? How great the losses would be? And how many living beings would die in the process? All of this depended on how they handled it over the next period of time. If they handled it well, then the damage to the multiverse would be minimal. At that time, after the multiverse was fused, there would be even more powerful forces left behind. In the end, the fused world would be even larger, and there would be even more resources inside. In that case, they would have a greater chance of victory against the new myriad heavens realms. However, if they didn't handle it well, then perhaps just this fusion alone would be enough to almost completely destroy the multiverse. Perhaps at that time, the fused world might only be a few times stronger than any other world. It might even cause nearly 99% of the living beings in the multiverse to die. These two outcomes were now placed in front of them, waiting for them to choose. Under such circumstances, they really didn't have the mind to pay attention to anything else. In fact, just the changes from before had already caused this fusion to slide towards the second outcome. The number of living beings that died because of their divine clone was probably enough to fill up an extremely unbelievable world. However, the wisdom ancestors didn't feel too guilty about this, nor did they lament about their mistakes. Instead, he focused all of his attention and energy on the fusion that was about to take place. After all, if they worked hard now, then the losses would only stop at this step. However, if they didn't work hard and continued to regret and feel guilty about their mistakes, then what awaited them would be even greater losses. The number of living beings that would die would also increase by countless times. There's a new world, At this moment, in the new multiverse, the consciousnesses of the powerhouses were communicating with the multiverse. Since it was a war, there would naturally be powerhouses that stood out and allowed their positions to stand above all living beings. In fact, the most fundamental purpose of this war was to reduce the current large number of powerhouses to one. At the very least, they had to reduce it to an organization. At this moment, the new multiverse clearly hadn't reached the final stage yet. Therefore, there were currently quite a number of powerhouses that stood above all living beings and could use their consciousnesses to penetrate the multiverse and communicate with each other. Chapter 2596. Kill. The roars of those pinnacle powerhouses entered the ears of their subordinates, directly shaking their bodies and minds. The many living beings who were shocked by such a vast and boundless world instantly snapped back to their senses. They only felt that their vision had turned blood red. The originally incomparably beautiful and vast world no longer shocked them. Instead, there was only a kind of rejection and disgust. Under the urging of this rejection and disgust, as they roared, they pounced towards the place in this vast world that was clearly where living beings gathered. In the blink of an eye, they had already rushed into that world. As they rushed into this world, the wind and clouds began to surge. It was unknown how many thunders and tremors appeared in this world. The entire world seemed to have suddenly come to life and began to madly reject the new living beings that had rushed in from the various worlds. Sizzle, 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 sizzle. At this moment, in the depths of that world, the wisdom ancestors were filled with surprise. The world is mending. One of the wisdom ancestors cried out in surprise. At this moment, the other wisdom ancestors were also indescribably happy. The reason was very simple. At this moment, in the depths of that world, in the many areas where cracks could originally be seen under the effect of some external force, those cracks were rapidly mending. Originally, they had spent a great deal of effort and energy but were still unable to truly close the crack. However, in the blink of an eye, 1/1000th of the crack had already disappeared. Although this speed wasn't too fast, one mustn't forget that this was based on the entire world as a base. And this world was formed by who knew how many tens of thousands of worlds, or even hundreds of millions of worlds, were gathered together. With such a huge base, even if 100 millionth of the cracks disappeared, the absolute number was already extremely considerable. How could this not make the wisdom ancestors feel indescribably happy? As the wisdom ancestors, these living beings' innate intelligence was naturally quite powerful. At this moment, they only needed a little thought to understand the source of all this. They even understood how to speed up the speed of this mending. So, as long as there is an external enemy, this world can be stimulated. Looks like this war can't end too early, one of the wisdom ancestors lamented. Hearing this, the other wisdom ancestors nodded indifferently. That was how it was. Although this world was filled with countless cracks, it was still a world and could be considered complete. Under such circumstances, the world's various instincts and even the world's will had already taken shape. If this kind of embryonic form continued to develop normally, perhaps it would take an incomparably long period of time before it could truly grow and truly become the instinct and will of the world that was the complete world. However, if there was a change in the situation and an external enemy joined the fray, then this growth process that originally required a long period of time would obviously be shortened, just like how a person would become more powerful in the face of a life and death crisis. It would stimulate a stronger potential. When the world encountered a life and death crisis, their potential would also erupt. Growth that originally required a long time to accumulate could also be obtained in an instant. The reason why the crack in the depths of this world had healed was because the invading power of the old world had become so powerful that it could threaten the life and death of this world. It should be noted that this new universe was a chaotic cluster of worlds. Within it, wars between worlds were breaking out at almost every moment. It was easy to imagine how good the cultivation civilization, which had developed under such a background, was at invading other worlds. And now, The top powerhouses of the old universes were using the technology they had used to invade other universes to invade the old universes. In this way, when they entered this world, they had already used all kinds of technology and all kinds of preparations they had made before to separate themselves from the world, avoiding direct attacks from this world. Then, with the help of all kinds of conversion methods, they transformed the powerful destructive power into destructive power that the laws of this world could accept. After that, under the guidance of various techniques, they automatically understood the distribution of power in this world. Therefore, when they pounced towards the places where the living beings gathered, these peak powerhouses also divided themselves into different groups. The proportion of people who headed towards different places was completely different. The power was the strongest in the key places, while the power was slightly weaker in the secondary places. It could be said that in an extremely short period of time, they had already grasped the crux of this world. In the face of such an invasion, the living beings in this vast world reacted one by one and understood that this disaster wasn't the natural disaster that had caused the drastic changes in the world before. Therefore, they quickly gathered their strength and began to brazenly face the invaders. Although they didn't have the wisdom ancestor to guide them, the living beings in the old universe were actually not weak. Especially during the disaster of the fusion of the universe this time, they had gained a lot of enlightenment, and in the end, their strength had unknowingly increased by a few times or even several times. Under such circumstances, although the fighting power they erupted with when facing the invaders was weaker than that of the invaders, it wasn't that much weaker. At the very least, they could still fight back and forth with the invaders, and they could also cause considerable losses to the invaders. Of course, this was under the circumstances that the peak experts hadn't joined in. The peak experts were much stronger than the invaders, and they could even control their emotions with a single sentence. Compared to the living beings in this world, their minds were much stronger. Under such circumstances, if they joined such a normal invading team, the increase in the invading team's strength would definitely be earth-shattering. However, it was obvious that the peak experts had their own mission at that time. Their mission was to find the peak experts of this world. As long as there were cultivators in a world, as long as there were extraordinary living beings, then there would definitely be peak experts who far surpassed all other living beings. The only difference was how powerful the pinnacle experts were. It was the pinnacle of the world, or the pinnacle of the myriad of worlds, or perhaps it was the true, supreme pinnacle. No matter what kind of peak it was, as long as they were peak experts, they were obviously not simple people. In their own world, the strength they could display would be far stronger than their normal strength. In addition to this unimaginably vast world that even these peak experts were extremely shocked, it was hard to say how powerful the peak experts of this world were. In that case, how could these pinnacle powerhouses not set their sights on the pinnacle powerhouses of this world? If they ignored them and waited for them to make their move, the entire world might be overturned and all the invaders might be wiped out in an instant. It wasn't like this hadn't happened in the past. Therefore, at this time, these peak experts were exploring this world on their own, searching for the peak experts of this world. However, no matter how hard they searched, they couldn't find the existence of such peak experts. In the entire world, it seemed like only the living beings that were resisting the invaders were left in front of them, and they only had some ability to resist. This situation made those peak powerhouses feel apprehensive. There were a few reasons why they couldn't find the peak experts. Firstly, there were no peak experts in this world that were worthy of their attention. Secondly, the peak experts were hiding in a place that they hadn't discovered. Thirdly, which was also what they were most worried about, was that the peak experts were far stronger than them. It was precisely because they were so powerful that they couldn't find their existences no matter how hard they searched. This made them certain that there were no peak experts in this world. Obviously, no matter how they thought about it, the first possibility was impossible. In that case, there were obviously only the second and third possibilities. Regardless of the second or third possibility, it was obviously not a good thing for them. Needless to say, the third possibility was far stronger than them, so much so that they couldn't even sense it. They might be wiped out by a finger at any time. The second possibility seemed to be better than the third, but in fact, there was a limit to how good it was. After all, if they were hiding in a place that they couldn't find at all, wouldn't it be like they were hiding in the dark while they were in the light? In that case, the enemy didn't need to be too strong. As long as their strength was acceptable, they could get rid of them one by one through sneak attacks. Because of this, the more these peak experts couldn't find the peak experts, the more vigilant they were. For a time, they naturally didn't have the time to participate in the real invasion. In this way, the invading subordinates and the living beings in the old heavens and realms that originally existed in this world fell into a state of protracted war. They fought back and forth, and the losses they suffered at every moment were enough to make both sides feel heartache. In such a battle, both sides' advantages and disadvantages were equally obvious. For the invaders, they had crossed through space and could be said to be a lone army deep in the enemy's territory. Not only were their logistics limited, but there were also fewer combatants if they died. Their ability to continue fighting was far worse than that of the Guardians. Compared to their disadvantages, their advantage was that they were stronger and more experienced when it came to invading. This kind of valiant strength and rich experience was enough for them to use the fastest speed to extract the resources from the territories they occupied in this world and turn them into potential for war. For the Guardian living beings, their disadvantage was very obvious. Compared to the invaders, they were weaker. This weak strength caused them to retreat step by step in the battle, constantly giving up the resources of this world and allowing their opponents to seize them. Compared to this disadvantage, their advantage was also quite obvious. This advantage was none other than the fact that this was their world. This was because this was their world, and they were fighting on their home ground. Even if they lost a living being, they could be replenished at the same time. Moreover, the various geographical advantages of this world were also quite advantageous to them. The speed at which the resources were converted into power was also quite fast. In this way, as long as they could drag things out long enough, they would eventually be able to reverse the situation step by step and finally obtain victory. As long as their opponents didn't come to replenish their forces, they wouldn't be destroyed before that happened. This kind of battle was constantly going on. For this world, it was equivalent to constantly increasing the pressure. Under such circumstances, in the depths of this world, the cracks at the border of the various worlds were also constantly mending. As this happened, the Wisdom Ancestor, who was guarding and pushing everything forward, was both worried and delighted. Needless to say, they were happy to see the world quickly becoming complete and their initial plan being completed step by step. How could they not be happy? However, they were worried because they had already understood the nature of the cracks mending. The more cracks mended and the faster they mended, it meant that the situation outside was getting more and more dangerous. It was even to the point where the world was destroyed and civilization was on the verge of extinction. How could they not be worried? In the face of such a situation, the Wisdom Ancestor could only do their best to help this world mend the cracks and make it complete so that they could be free to deal with the invaders as soon as possible. Suddenly, one of the Wisdom Ancestor lamented, "The laws brought by that sky alternate being are simply too powerful. What? You've analyzed it?" Another Wisdom Ancestor was taken aback and asked in surprise. One must know that if one didn't analyze the laws, it wouldn't be appropriate to praise the power of those laws. However, the Wisdom Ancestor was actually praising it at this moment, and was even acting so resolutely. No matter how one looked at it, it seemed like they had gained something. "That's right. I've already analyzed it." At this moment, the Wisdom Ancestor sighed. As he spoke, a ball of laws appeared out of thin air in the senses of many Wisdom Ancestors. Chapter 2597. But how is this possible? One of the Wisdom Ancestors said in disbelief. Upon hearing this, the Wisdom Ancestor who had spoken first said, "What's impossible about it? You have to know that this is our world." He accentuated the words "we." These words clearly expressed the meaning that he wanted to express vividly. The other Wisdom Ancestors also came to a sudden realization. Indeed, If these laws had appeared in a world where any of them had perfect control, it wouldn't have taken much effort for them to extract them. In fact, their instincts alone would have allowed them to do it. From this perspective, it wasn't surprising that the wisdom ancestor was able to do this. What's special about these laws? One of the wisdom ancestors grasped the key point and asked directly. It stands above the myriad of worlds in the heavens. I can feel a kind of transcendence from them. The wisdom ancestor seemed to be in an indescribable shock as his voice trembled slightly. Above, transcendence. The other wisdom ancestors were dumbfounded. It was just a type of law, yet it was able to stand above the universe and possess the kind of transcendence that they dreamed of. How could they not be shocked? How could they not be shocked? At this moment, the wisdom ancestor didn't continue speaking. Instead, he sent the clump of laws that he had analyzed and extracted into the communication space of the other wisdom ancestors. Although the many wisdom ancestors seemed to be facing each other, they were actually quite far away from each other. The reason why they could appear as if they were facing each other was because they used their senses to forcefully construct a communication space that resembled real space-time. The essence of this communication space was naturally illusory. It only existed because these wisdom ancestors believed that it existed. However, even in such a space of communication, due to the extremely high essence of the wisdom ancestors, it possessed some characteristics of real space-time. For example, sending the laws of the present into the communication space allowed the wisdom ancestors to inspect, analyze, and research them at will. This was one of the characteristics at this moment. This clump of laws appeared in the communication space and was instantly imprinted in the senses of the wisdom ancestors. Just now, when the wisdom ancestor took out the law that had been analyzed and refined, although they could sense it from afar, it was only a tiny bit from afar. It couldn't even be considered a blur, so how could they truly come to a complete conclusion? But now, when the wisdom ancestor placed the clump of laws in the communication space, they could clearly feel the clump of laws and understand the indescribable characteristics contained within the clump of laws. This is the laws of beyond the heavens. The wisdom ancestors were all shocked. If it were not for the fact that they had already experienced a few times, they would have been able to maintain the stability of their current mission no matter what happened. Otherwise, just the shock alone would have been enough to bring a shocking amount of damage to this world, causing a large portion of the living beings that had survived the various dangers to die. At this moment, in the clump of laws, they didn't know if they felt a sense of superiority or detachment, but they also felt an indescribable sense of perfection. This kind of perfection was so obvious and intense that they suddenly felt that all the power, laws, and realms that they had grasped were riddled with holes and had no redeeming qualities at all. More importantly, even though they felt this kind of perfection and such a great disparity, they couldn't find a way to perfect themselves. This feeling was the most despairing. At this moment, they understood why this kind of perfection was so much more intense than the feeling of superiority and detachment. Why the wisdom ancestor, who was the first to obtain this clump of laws, didn't mention this kind of perfection at all and treated it as if it didn't exist. This was clearly because of the incomparably intense sense of defeat and despair that welled up in their hearts. It was precisely because of this sense of defeat and despair that the wisdom ancestor wasn't willing to mention this matter at all. In fact, he would rather use this kind of self-deceiving method to ignore it. At this moment, the other wisdom ancestors also had the same impulse. He wanted to ignore this matter. He wanted to ignore this kind of perfection. Is this our limit? At that moment, one of the wisdom progenitors suddenly spoke. His voice was filled with defeat, despair, and an indescribable unwillingness. Perhaps we have misunderstood that foreign mutant. At this moment, another wisdom ancestor suddenly spoke. Misunderstood? Another wisdom ancestor asked in confusion. Perhaps to that foreign mutant, our universe is nothing more than an illusory projection reflected in a mirror. Is it really interested in occupying such an illusory projection? Are you interested in turning the myriad heavens and myriad worlds into your own? The ancestor of wisdom spoke again. Upon hearing this, the other wisdom ancestors fell silent. They couldn't help but admit that this explanation was actually very reasonable. For example, they weren't interested in the illusions of certain living beings at all. Even if they entered the illusions to explore, they would at most investigate the principles behind the illusions. They definitely wouldn't want to take the illusions for themselves. Using this analogy, just the laws that the foreign mutant itself controlled were already countless times more perfect than the laws of the universe. To him, what was the difference between the myriad heavens and realms and the dream world? Since there was no difference, their previous guesses that the otherworldly creature had come in with a scheme to plot against them and take over the myriad heavens and realms, as its own were, of course, no longer valid. However, it was a challenge to their self-esteem to admit it. Thus, at this moment, the wisdom ancestors all continued to remain silent. Suddenly, one of the wisdom ancestors asked, "Is there really no way to break through?" Hearing this, the other progenitors of wisdom instantly turned their chaotic thoughts back from all over the place and focused on the question that was raised at this moment. Compared to challenging their pride, this question that concerned their future achievements was clearly more important. It was also more worthy of their attention. At this moment, the wisdom ancestor who had taken out the laws suddenly said, "Actually, the solution is right in front of us, isn't it?" Those words stunned all of the wisdom progenitors. They didn't understand what the wisdom ancestor meant by right in front of us. The difference in wisdom between them wasn't huge. Even if there was a small difference, it wasn't enough for one person to think of something that the others couldn't think of. Under such circumstances, they didn't think that someone could actually think of a solution for something that they couldn't figure out. In fact, the solution had already been placed in front of them. Under such circumstances, the wisdom ancestors practically racked their brains and tried their best to think of everything, searching for a possible way for them to break through as the wisdom ancestors. The wisdom ancestor who had said that there was a solution didn't say much. He just stared at the clump of laws in the communication space. When some of the wisdom ancestors occasionally glanced at him, they discovered that something was amiss and couldn't help but shift their gazes from everywhere to the clump of laws. Soon after, more and more wisdom ancestors discovered that something was amiss and couldn't help but shift their gazes to the clump of laws in the communication space. Following this, the scene fell silent again. However, compared to before, this silence was a completely different kind of silence. Previously, there was confusion and oppression, but now there was hesitation, surprise, and hesitation. Fusing with these laws? If that's the case, won't we also become extraterrestrial oddities? If that's the case, won't we be rejected by the universe? One of the wisdom ancestors said. Hearing this, the other wisdom ancestors didn't answer. However, from the changes in their expressions, it was clear that they were also hesitant about this. They had already found what they lacked, what they were fundamentally lacking. Although they couldn't figure out how to perfect themselves, wasn't that perfect standard right in front of them? As long as they could integrate that perfect standard into their own bodies, from the inside to the outside, they could completely transform into that perfect standard state. Then, wouldn't they be able to make up for their own shortcomings and flaws? However, if that was the case, their essence would also change. From the wisdom ancestors that were originally favored by the universe, they would become extraterrestrial oddities that were rejected by the universe. If that was the case, the old universe, which was originally their home field, might immediately turn around and treat them as mortal enemies. Endless attacks and endless tribulations would instantly pour down on them. In that case, whether or not they could still live was a problem, let alone become perfect and take a step further to transcend. Suddenly, one of the wisdom ancestors said, "Let's wait until the world's transformation is complete." These words caused the other wisdom ancestors to heave a sigh of relief. Although they had only pushed the issue back, they were still able to relax at this time. They finally had the time and opportunity to breathe a sigh of relief. They didn't have to make a decision right now. As such, to them, this was of course a good thing that was hard to come by. Then, what should we do with this clump of laws? One of the wisdom ancestors asked. "Put it away," another wisdom ancestor said. The wisdom ancestor who took out the clump of laws first nodded. With a wave of his hand, the clump of laws left the communication space and returned to his hand. He put away. During this process, the senses of the other wisdom ancestors were all focused on this mass of laws, and they seemed to be in a rather impatient state. The wisdom ancestor, who had put away the laws, was well aware of this, but he had no intention of paying attention to it. He believed that everyone's final decision would be the same as his own, and they would fuse the laws into themselves. After the clump of laws was put away, the communication space fell into complete silence. In the following days, the many wisdom ancestors seemed to be quite busy. They only maintained the world so that it wouldn't collapse. As for what they were originally doing, which was trying their best to speed up the closing of the cracks in the world, they no longer had the mood to care about it. In contrast, in that world, in the battlefield between the invaders from other worlds and the native anti-invasion forces of this world, there were more forces. These forces existed in these battlefields, as if they were coveting and gathering something. Faintly discernible from time to time, an invisible existence would be snatched away from the battlefield and disappear into the void, as if it had never appeared. Apart from the wisdom ancestors, no one else knew about this situation. It was the same for the new pinnacle powerhouses of the various worlds. In this battle, they still withdrew themselves from the outside and worked hard to search for pinnacle powerhouses that existed in the old worlds that were at least on par with them. These pinnacle powerhouses were only focused on searching for hidden places in this world, searching for the hidden space-time that existed in the depths of the void, try to find hidden existences that could threaten them. Although they paid some attention to the battlefield, they only paid attention to the general situation and the situation of the invaders' victory. Because of the inaction of the wisdom ancestors, the invaders were winning again and again. Although they hadn't completely defeated the resistance in this world, they had already unknowingly built a considerable number of strongholds in this world. They even started to use this world's resources to support the upcoming battles and replenish their various consumption during the battles. This situation clearly made up for the invaders' weakness of not being able to fight a prolonged battle for the invaders. The advantage they had was self-evident. Chapter 2598. The invasion and anti-invasion war lasted for an unimaginably long time. It was so much so that the reinforcements from the other worlds were already prepared, and the war was still going on. Apart from the fact that the vast and boundless world had become even bloodier and filled with a baleful aura, it didn't seem much different from the beginning. The wisdom ancestor was still hidden in the depths of the world, while the new pinnacle powerhouses of the various worlds were still carefully searching the world at this moment. Several hundred years had passed for both of them. It's about time. On this day, in the depths of the world, a wisdom ancestor said, for several hundred years, due to the pressure from the invaders, the healing of the world had continued. Now, hundreds of years later, this kind of healing was already close to a limit. This boundary was, of course, not the boundary that all the cracks in the depths of the world could completely heal. Even if there was external pressure, with the number of cracks in the depths of the world and the speed at which they were healing, several hundred years wouldn't be enough for them to completely heal. In fact, this boundary was the boundary of this world's stability. When a number and width of the cracks exceeded this limit, if there was no external force to maintain it, the world would collapse and scatter due to the rejection of the many parts. In the end, it would turn back into countless fragments, and the world would turn back into the heavens and realms. When the number and width of the cracks decreased or shrunk to below the boundary, then the world would truly become a world, and the structure of this single world would truly stabilize. In other words, as long as this boundary was broken, from now on, the world would no longer need the power of the wisdom ancestor. Just by relying on the power of the world itself, it would be able to maintain its integrity and continue to automatically heal the cracks in the depths of the world. In the end, after a long time, the entire world would truly be completely healed and truly complete. It could be said that this boundary was a crucial boundary for both the world and the wisdom ancestor. As long as this boundary was broken, then the wisdom ancestor would truly be able to extricate themselves and start doing whatever they originally wanted to do. For this world, crossing this boundary also meant that it had truly taken shape. It meant that it had truly been born. It no longer needed to look at the faces of other living beings or struggle at death's door. Indeed, it's about time. Next, I plan to drive out that invader first. What do you all think? Another ancestor of wisdom said, I feel that there's no need to expel them anymore. At that moment, a wisdom ancestor suddenly spoke up. These words caused the expressions of the other wisdom ancestors to change slightly. One of them asked, why do you say that? Haven't you noticed? Their rules have unknowingly integrated into this world. Even though we've been collecting the rules on them, we've only been able to collect a small portion of them. The majority of the laws have scattered into the world. After such a long time, they have already become a part of the world. The wisdom ancestor, who had said that there was no need to expel them, sighed as he explained. Hearing this, the expressions of the other wisdom ancestors changed slightly. Their intelligence was similarly brilliant, so how could they possibly be unable to discern exactly what the wisdom ancestor was trying to express? He was clearly saying that the invaders had already been acknowledged by the world. Currently, the battle between the invaders and the living beings of the world had unknowingly become an internal conflict of the world, an internal struggle. Under such circumstances, even if the living beings of the world won, the wisdom ancestor wouldn't be happy. Even if the invaders won, the wisdom ancestor would only be happy to see it happen. No matter what, I'm not willing to sit by and watch as my civilization falls, another wisdom ancestor said indifferently. His words were filled with determination. The expressions of the other wisdom ancestors changed slightly. Some were praising, some agreed, some were disdainful, some were indifferent, and some were even disgusted. All of these attitudes had clearly displayed the thoughts of the wisdom ancestors in full display. Sensing everyone's attitudes, the wisdom ancestors understood that the days of mutual trust between them were about to pass. Next, when the world crossed that boundary, it would be time for them to go their separate ways. What's going on with this world? In that world, a peak powerhouse had a somewhat indescribable expression on his face. Ever since the beginning, the feeling this world gave him had started to change bit by bit. It was just that the change was extremely slow and subtle, so it didn't attract their attention. But after the accumulation of hundreds of years, this change had unknowingly strengthened to the extent that they couldn't help but pay attention to it. Compared to before, the rejection from this world had actually weakened to the point that it was almost non-existent. Originally, when they were near this world, they felt as if they were beside a colossal beast that could turn over and completely crush them into powder at any time. Even if they were just here, they couldn't help but tremble and want to escape. But now, although they could still feel that this world was rejecting them, this rejection seemed to be of a completely different nature. Instead, it seemed to be a rejection that came from their own rejection of the world, and not the world truly rejecting them. What the hell? Why do I have this feeling? We're clearly invaders. How can there be a world that welcomes invaders? Thinking about it, the peak powerhouse shook his head and wanted to get rid of his misconception. But as time passed, this feeling became more and more obvious. In the end, it reached a point that even if he tried to get rid of it time and time again, he still couldn't get rid of it completely. Perhaps I should give it a try. This thought appeared in his mind. Just as he was thinking about this, one of the pinnacle experts had already released his means of isolation from the world and was directly exposed in that world. At this moment, a terrifying suction force suddenly came from that peak powerhouse and started to frantically engulf the mysterious aura that belonged to that world. That aura frantically surged into the body of the pinnacle expert, pushing him towards a higher level. In just a few breaths of time, the pinnacle expert had taken another small step towards the pinnacle. He's a step ahead of me. At this moment, that peak powerhouse furrowed his brows, and this thought flashed in his mind. However, he didn't immediately release his defensive method along with that peak powerhouse. Instead, he started to carefully observe that peak powerhouse to see if there were any changes to his body. Before this, he was anxious to test what would happen if he was completely exposed to that world. But now that someone had gotten ahead of him, he wasn't anxious anymore. After all, what he wanted to know could be obtained from someone else. Furthermore, he didn't have to take the risk himself, so it was naturally for the best. If the other party had obtained some benefits, then even though it would be a little slower for him to come back, it wouldn't be a big deal at all. However, if the other party suffered a loss, it would be equivalent to him denying the option of directly exposing himself to the world. All these thoughts flashed through his mind at this moment, causing him to pay even more attention to that peak powerhouse who had been exposed to the world. With his perceptive ability, he could clearly sense that apart from himself, the other peak powerhouses were also paying attention to that peak powerhouse who had been exposed. Clearly, they had also thought of the same thing as the other two and were also treating that peak powerhouse who had been exposed to the world as a test subject. So that's how it is. At this moment, that peak powerhouse who had been exposed suddenly burst into laughter. As he laughed, a strong aura suddenly seeped out of his body, and his entire temperament began to rise rapidly. In the blink of an eye, the power fluctuations that emanated from his body broke through to another realm. As his power fluctuations broke through to another realm, he seemed to completely not exist in the eyes of the many peak powerhouses. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared without a trace. What's going on? The other peak powerhouses were all dumbfounded. At this moment, their attitudes had all changed. Some were extremely surprised and wanted to expose themselves to that world as well. However, some were inexplicably panicked and tried their best to strengthen their own defenses, trying their best to isolate themselves from the outside world. The reason for this was obviously that they now had a different view of that peak powerhouse who had been exposed. Those peak powerhouses who wanted to lift their defenses and expose themselves clearly thought that the test subject had already obtained great benefits, and his strength had increased to an unimaginable, undetectable level. As for the remaining peak powerhouses, they thought that the test subject had already been integrated or eliminated by the world. This was the only way that they could completely not sense the existence of that peak powerhouse. As they split up, the peak powerhouses lifted their defenses one by one and directly exposed themselves. Then endless power, endless information, and endless mysterious aura continuously surged into the bodies of those peak powerhouses, pushing their realms forward continuously. In just a short period of time, they had completed a breakthrough that would have originally taken who knew how many tens of thousands of years to complete. Then, one after another, they stepped into a realm that other peak experts couldn't detect, disappearing from the senses of those peak experts. The speed at which they changed varied, but the speed was not completely related to their strength, comprehension, and accumulation. Instead, it was related to the speed at which they lifted their defenses. The faster they lifted their defenses, the faster they would transform. This was the case even if they had very little accumulation. And the slower they lifted their defenses, the slower they would transform, even if they had accumulated a lot of accumulation. If I die, then so be it. At this moment, the peak powerhouse who had wanted to be the first to lift his defenses but had been beaten to it by someone else thought to himself. He immediately dispersed the barrier that he had set up to isolate himself from the outside world. As he dispersed the barrier, his body seemed to have instantly turned into a black hole and began to frantically absorb everything in the outside world. It was not just power, aura, or even just aura. It was an existence that was even more fundamental and more fundamental. It was an existence that filled the entire world and made people feel as if it was the origin of the world. It was a kind of chill. As this chill surged into him, he felt that everything about him was being sublimated. The mysterious feeling that originally existed in the depths of his body that he could not fathom at all and only felt like it was an instinct started to rapidly expand at this moment. In the end, it replaced his body, replaced all the power in his body, all the laws, all the space-time, and completely filled his body. As this change occurred, the peak powerhouse felt his body and mind start to frantically improve. In a daze, he saw an incomparably majestic figure. It was a figure that he felt extremely close to, as if it was everything in the universe. The figure only glanced at him indifferently before disappearing. However, just this glance was enough to make the peak powerhouse feel an indescribable joy and an unimaginable sense of fulfillment. It was as if just this glance had already made him experience an indescribable sublimation. At this moment, he felt that he had already reached perfection. Everything that he had been paying attention to seemed to have become insignificant in the face of this perfection, and there was no longer any meaning to it. So that's how it is. An indescribable emotion appeared in his heart, causing him to involuntarily let out a sigh like the other peak powerhouses from before. As he sighed, he felt that he had broken into a realm that he had always dreamed of, a realm where he could control everything, experience everything, and observe everything. A realm where he could see, with a single glance, exactly where the peak powerhouses in this world were. Could it be that this is your mentality? Did you think that we were merely ants in the past, and that as long as you cared about us, you could completely erase us in an instant? He said as he looked at the wisdom ancestors that existed in the depths of the world. At this moment, he only had eyes for the wisdom ancestors. This was because they felt that the wisdom ancestors had an existence that was of the same origin as them, but it was faintly purer. Chapter 2599. In comparison, the current wisdom ancestor and the peak powerhouses were like salt, while the world was a living being that needed salt. At this moment, the wisdom ancestors were like extremely pure salt. As for the peak powerhouses, they were like salt that had been added to various ingredients and mixed with other flavors. Any living being that had a normal sense of taste would find it difficult to consume pure salt. However, if salt was added to ingredients, even if there was a little more salt, it would still be acceptable to living beings that had a normal sense of taste. That was why the world's attitude towards the peak powerhouses and the wisdom ancestors was so different at this moment. The wisdom ancestor could clearly see this difference at this moment. At this moment, an indescribable joy surged in his heart. The conflict, shame, and guilt he felt before he fused with the laws from the otherworldly mutants had already disappeared without a trace. With a slight thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure had already broken through this world and stepped out of it. After arriving outside the world, he felt relaxed. The origin energy that existed outside the world that gave birth to the world, in other words, the chill, was a lot thinner than in the world. If this thinness was in the past, it would have made him feel uncomfortable. However, at this moment, it meant that the suppression had been reduced. However, no matter how small it was, the suppression still existed. Thus, at this moment, he turned his gaze in a certain direction. In that direction was everything that he was looking forward to. This was the feeling that appeared in his heart. This feeling was similar to intuition or even a premonition. At this time, one wisdom ancestor after another stepped out from that world and appeared beside him. At the same time, the figures of the wisdom ancestors also changed. From their original strange forms, they turned into humanoid figures. It was just that some of the wisdom ancestors' human forms were more perfect, while others were missing something. However, even if they were missing something, they were only missing a few small details. As time passed, they were still undergoing subtle adjustments. Their bodies were becoming more and more perfect, more and more similar to human forms. Evidently, the wisdom ancestors had already fused with the laws from the otherworldly mutants that they had gathered over the years. When they said those words, the expressions of the wisdom ancestors all changed. Compared to before, they seemed to be extremely carefree now. They seemed to have broken free from all shackles, and they even faintly emitted a feeling of perfection. What should we do with them? One of the ancestor of wisdom asked. He was naturally referring to the people of their race that existed in that world. Hearing that, the wisdom ancestors smiled, but none of them answered the question. To these wisdom ancestors, everything in that world, including their own kind and the creatures that called them ancestors, was meaningless. When the wisdom ancestor heard the silence, he naturally understood what the other wisdom ancestors were thinking and could not help but sigh. Then, he didn't continue to dwell on that question. Instead, he seemed to change the topic and asked, "So, shall we set off now? Let's go. There's no longer anything worth staying here." Another ancestor of wisdom said calmly. As he said that, the other wisdom ancestors nodded. Immediately, everyone turned into rays of light that emitted faint heat and headed in the direction that they sensed. To them, that direction was no different from any other direction. It was only because they had sensed it that they chose that direction. However, if one were to look at it from outside the ice field, the direction they had chosen right now was actually upwards. They were heading toward the ice field. The ice field was extremely vast in Luo Fan's eyes. To the wisdom ancestors that were born in the world of the ice field, it was almost boundless. Even though they were guided by the senses in their hearts, and even though they had fused with the laws of the otherworldly beings, causing their power to skyrocket by tens of thousands of times, it still took them over 1,000 years to barely approach the surface of the ice field. At this moment, the surface of the ice field was still constantly cracking and mending. When they arrived at this place, the wisdom ancestors all stopped at the same time. To the living beings outside, what was before them was just a very ordinary surface of ice. However, to them, what was before them was the barrier between the outer sky and the inner sky. Once they crossed this barrier, they would be in the outer sky. If they didn't cross this barrier, they would be in the inner sky. Outside the barrier, they could clearly sense the endless mysterious power that they yearned for. Even through the barrier, they could clearly sense this power. In fact, they could even vaguely absorb a little of it. At this moment, to the living beings outside, it seemed like there were small spots of light flickering under the surface of the ice, as if they were breathing. What they were absorbing was none other than heat. At this moment, this place was naturally not a place with a lot of heat. In fact, compared to the normal regions of this world, the temperature here was much lower. Even living beings that liked low temperatures would feel that this place was rather cold. However, this was only to the living beings outside. To the living beings that were born in the world inside the ice, the temperature they had always been exposed to was the temperature inside the ice. It was the terrifying low temperature that was derived from the source of the cold law. Compared to the terrifying low temperature, the temperature above the ice that was extremely low to ordinary living beings was already an extremely high temperature to them. At this moment, the wisdom ancestors even felt an indescribable sense of panic amidst their extreme desire. It was a kind of panic caused by the fear of the boundless heat behind the barrier. While the wisdom ancestors have been traveling for thousands of years, in the world formed by the fusion of the old heavens and realms, the war of invasion and anti-invasion was still ongoing. However, compared to the beginning, this war was many times more relaxed. At the very beginning, the kind of fighting to the death had completely disappeared. Instead, it was more like a battle between two different races in this world. As for the peak powerhouses, they had already started to settle down in this world and become the peak powerhouses of this world. Their degree of integration with this world had unknowingly surpassed that of the wisdom ancestors back then. At this moment, no one would feel that it was wrong to say that they were experts that were born and raised in this world. At this stage, these peak powerhouses felt that this world was too wonderful and too comfortable. They even felt that as long as they were in this world, they would be able to improve endlessly and make endless progress. It was such a wonderful feeling that they didn't even want to leave this world. One by one, they moved their bases from the new worlds to this world. As for the territories in the new heavens and realms that they had in mind, they even felt that they were of little value and even had thoughts of giving them up. It must be known that they had spent a lot of effort and sacrificed a lot in order to seize those territories. None of these peak powerhouses felt that there was anything unusual about these strange changes. They only felt that they could only be considered to be truly complete in this world. They felt that as long as they could raise this world to a higher level, they would also be able to rise to a higher level. Apart from that, there was actually no need for the various heavens and realms or resources. In fact, it was this change in attitude that caused the invasion and anti-invasion war in this world to gradually ease up. After all, The living beings in this world had received the grace of these peak powerhouses time and time again. They had received their care time and time again. Moreover, the invaders had also become more and more amiable towards them. They had repeatedly expressed that they wanted to live in peace with them and only wanted to find a foothold in this world. Under such circumstances, without the wisdom ancestor controlling everything from behind the scenes, it was only natural that their attitudes would ease up a little. On a certain day, a peak powerhouse sighed and said to another peak powerhouse, "It's a pity that the wisdom ancestor escaped back then. Otherwise, we would have achieved perfection a long time ago." Because they had settled in this world together, and because they no longer had an urgent need for resources, the conflict between these peak powerhouses was naturally no longer so irreconcilable. Just like that, their relationship naturally became much closer after 1,000 years. At the very least, they were now more like friends, or rather, fellow cultivators. Another peak powerhouse smiled and said, "Why should we not be content? We only need to continue staying in this world, and after a certain period of time, we will naturally be able to achieve perfection. In comparison, it's not much different from directly devouring them. It's also safer, so what's there to be dissatisfied about? Even so, why do I feel that there's something wrong with their departure?" The peak powerhouse who spoke earlier sighed. "What's wrong? They know that they can't beat us, so they fled together. Isn't that normal?" The peak powerhouse who spoke later laughed. "Although they can't beat us, the gap shouldn't be so big that they have no choice but to flee. If it were me, I wouldn't give up this world no matter what. Even if I have to fight to the death, I will die in this world." The peak powerhouse said with an extremely firm attitude. This kind of attitude would never appear on him in the past. As a peak powerhouse, he had experienced countless battles, choices, and moments of life and death. How could he be the kind of person who would rather die than submit? How could he easily give up his life for something? Normally, when faced with an unstoppable force, he would probably abandon even his own son. How could he give up his life for a world? However, at this moment, such words came out of his mouth without any contradiction. During this process, whether it was him or the peak powerhouse who heard these words, they didn't feel anything unusual. It was as if it was only natural. Now that you put it this way, it's indeed a little strange. However, no matter what they think, even if they want to come back now, there's no other way. We don't need to care about them at all. The peak powerhouse thought for a while and shook his head. Indeed, now that our foundation in this world has been stabilized, even if they come back, they will become outsiders. We don't need to fear them anymore. The peak powerhouse who spoke first laughed. His expression was full of satisfaction. It wasn't just these two peak powerhouses who felt satisfied at this moment. The other peak powerhouses were also very satisfied and felt extremely satisfied. This incomparably vast world had become their own world, and they had become the rulers of this world. This result was even more wonderful and satisfying than the feeling of conquering countless worlds in the past. Under such circumstances, how could they not feel satisfied? In a place that they couldn't see, in the depths of the world, the crack in the world had unknowingly closed by 90%. This closing speed was tens of thousands of times faster than the original estimation of the wisdom ancestor. Normally, it would probably take millions, tens of millions, or even hundreds of millions of years to close to this extent. Apart from his closing, there seemed to be something mysterious on the origin of this world. It seemed to be an existence that was completely opposite to the nature of the origin. This existence was entangled with the origin, maintaining an indescribable balance in an extremely mysterious way. Through this balance, the entire world was evolving and sublimating bit by bit. From a macro perspective, this world that was originally completely integrated with the ice field had unknowingly gained a sense of existence. Chapter 2600. At this moment, the wisdom ancestors all felt their hairs stand on end. It was as if they had become weak ants that were being eyed by a ferocious beast. This feeling made the wisdom ancestors' hearts clench. Who's targeting us? The same thought appeared in their minds at the same time. Just as this thought appeared in their minds, the healing of the world just happened to cross the boundary. It finally became a world that could repair itself and no longer needed external assistance to heal itself. Faced with this situation, the wisdom ancestors suddenly felt an indescribable sense of emptiness. It was as if some mysterious protection that had been placed on them had loosened up at that moment. Along with this feeling, the hair-raising feeling from before became even more intense at this moment. If they had felt like ants being eyed by a ferocious beast before, then now, they felt like ants being eyed by a divine dragon. This world has abandoned us. One of the wisdom ancestors roared in shock and anger. At this moment, an invading pinnacle powerhouse who had already undergone a transformation flashed and appeared beside one of the wisdom ancestors. He raised his hand and grabbed at the wisdom ancestor. The wisdom ancestor's form was extremely strange. It wasn't a human form, nor was it the form of a living being with flesh and blood that existed in the outside world. Instead, it was like a ball of ever-changing brilliance. At that moment, the living being's body shuddered when it was grabbed, and waves of mysterious power naturally emerged to block the peak powerhouse. The peak powerhouse came from a new universe. In this new universe, due to the influence of the rules of the otherworldly alternate entity, although its essence was similar to a light living being, its form was similar to that of a human. At the very least, the brilliant ones, such as the pinnacle powerhouses, had a form that was almost indistinguishable from a human form. Under such circumstances, the peak powerhouse's attack on the wisdom ancestor was like a humanoid living being attacking some kind of ever-changing monster. "How dare you?" Another wisdom ancestor roared furiously. Then, with a flash of his body, he traversed through the void from where he was and arrived at the place where the wisdom ancestor was being attacked. Then, he launched an attack at the peak powerhouse. Facing such an attack, the pinnacle expert only sneered. His body moved, and as he circulated his power, he actually received the blessing of this world. His power was unimaginably powerful. With just a slight movement, he easily blocked the new wisdom ancestor's attack. Instead, he even used that attack to attack the original wisdom ancestor. As this happened, the wisdom ancestor could only try his best to dodge. As he dodged, he actually felt something he had never felt before, the rejection of the world. It was as if his position and that of the invaders had been completely reversed. Instead, they had become the invaders of this world and were the enemies of this world. Faced with such a situation, the wisdom ancestor felt indescribable grief and indignation. As he fought against the invaders, he was continuously injured as he retreated. From time to time, he felt parts of his body being sliced off and absorbed bit by the peak powerhouse. The scale of the battle between them was extremely grand, and the power and techniques involved had reached a level that the living beings of this world couldn't even imagine. The tremors and rumbles continued to spread from the depths of the world, causing the entire world to tremble. For a time, even the invasion and counter-invasion in this world had unknowingly slowed down a little. Although the wisdom ancestors themselves didn't have deep feelings for each other, they had already become grasshoppers on a rope. After all, their interests were already intertwined. Under such circumstances, the other progenitors of wisdom watched as the progenitor of wisdom retreated step by step. Even his own body and power were being devoured bit by bit. How could he stand aside and watch? As they roared, all sorts of power spread towards the battlefield in an attempt to support the wisdom ancestor. If there were no other peak powerhouses present, their plan might have succeeded. They might have been able to suppress the attack of the peak powerhouses and protect the wisdom ancestor. However, it was clear that didn't happen at this time. The other peak powerhouses couldn't just watch as they besieged the first peak powerhouse who attacked. When the wisdom ancestor attacked, the other peak powerhouses also attacked at the same time. One by one, they chose a wisdom ancestor and attacked and devoured him. The number of wisdom ancestors was much smaller than the number of peak powerhouses. Even if only a portion of the peak powerhouses let go of the barriers between themselves and the world and fused with it, the number of peak powerhouses was still much higher than the number of wisdom ancestors. Under such circumstances, even if the wisdom ancestors themselves were more experienced in this realm, they still couldn't withstand the siege of the peak powerhouses. Moreover, the peak powerhouses had grown up in the chaotic battle of the new multiverse. Compared to the wisdom ancestors who lived in the mostly peaceful old multiverse, their combat standards were clearly higher. Just like that, his own battle strength was clearly inferior, and he was still being besieged. The result was already self-evident. All of the wisdom ancestors were constantly retreating at this moment. One by one, they were giving up their body parts bit by bit. Unknowingly, every single one of them had already left the depths of that world and appeared in that world, appearing before everyone. At this time, both the invaders and the anti-invaders looked at the sky in disbelief. The invaders were shocked that there were living beings in this world that could actually fight against the peak powerhouses on their side. The anti-invaders, on the other hand, were shocked that the wisdom ancestors could actually be in such a sorry state. So what they said was actually true. There really is such a powerful force hidden in this world. But why didn't they make a move after so many years? This was what one of the invaders thought. After hundreds of years of invading and anti-invading, it was naturally impossible for the invaders and anti-invaders to not have any communication. According to the anti-invaders, the invaders wouldn't be able to be complacent for too long. This was because there was still a terrifying force hidden in this world that the invaders couldn't imagine. Once this terrifying force erupted, it would be easy for it to cleanse the entire universe. Naturally, the invaders were disdainful of the news. After all, there were legends of powerhouses in every world. Based on their experience in invading, the possibility of this legend being true was extremely small. In their opinion, the powerful force that the anti-invaders claimed was nothing more than a legend. But now, after hundreds of years of fighting, when the invaders felt that they were getting more and more comfortable and relaxed, this kind of power actually appeared. How could they not be shocked? Fortunately, they also had peak experts on their side who could resist this kind of power. They could even suppress this power and win against it. Otherwise, the good situation that they had established now might really be overturned. We can't wait anymore. One of the wisdom ancestors roared angrily at this moment. With this roar, he no longer hesitated. He devoured the laws of otherworldly entities that he had analyzed and refined from the dead invader, completely releasing himself to fuse with them. After so many years of fighting, any one of the wisdom ancestors had gathered enough of the laws that belonged to the otherworldly anomalies that they had analyzed and extracted from the invaders. The reason why they hadn't fused yet was because they still couldn't make up their minds. They didn't know what they would look like after fusing, whether they would be rejected by the world, and whether they would be unable to return home because of this. Now that they were being attacked from all sides, everything about them could be devoured by the invaders at any time. Perhaps they would disappear completely in the next instant, so they naturally didn't need to hesitate or worry about the consequences. As the laws fused with them, the wisdom ancestor felt his body and mind gradually sublimate. At the same time, he sensed that the world's rejection was also rapidly strengthening. It was as if the world, which originally didn't like them, had suddenly turned from dislike to disgust and then to hatred. However, the wisdom ancestor didn't care about this at all. At this moment, he only felt that his body, which was originally riddled with holes, was being mended. His originally strange and indescribable figure was rapidly transforming into an extremely perfect figure that was similar to the peak powerhouses that were attacking him. At this moment, the peak powerhouse that was attacking the wisdom ancestor felt that the creature in front of him suddenly exuded an aura that was similar to theirs. In fact, the creature's figure was even gradually transforming into their own. He couldn't help but be shocked. What's going on? What on earth did he eat? The peak powerhouse couldn't help but retreat, and his expression became extremely ugly. At this moment, he could no longer feel a sense of perfection from the creature in front of him. On the contrary, he felt a sense of disgust and disgust. It was as if the creature in front of him had turned from food to some sort of excrement after being digested. At this moment, thunder rumbled continuously in the sky. The rumbling sounds reverberated in the area, causing the entire area to shake. It seemed as if the foundation of the area had been shaken. At this moment, the wisdom ancestor felt extremely satisfied in the face of this thunder. A kind of heat was released from his body and gradually began to affect the surroundings, causing the surrounding space to distort indescribably. The entire world seemed to have become a flat surface in his eyes, turning into an illusory object. The continuous thunder that appeared in the sky was like applause at this moment. It didn't intimidate him at all. Instead, it made him feel a sense of joy from the bottom of his heart. "So, this is perfection," he muttered. At this moment, he felt that the world that he was extremely proud of had become so insignificant, and the living beings in his home that he originally cared about had lost all meaning in his heart. As for the peak powerhouse that had attacked him and forced him to retreat repeatedly, and in the end, a large part of his body had even been devoured by the wisdom ancestor. Now he had become so weak that he seemed like an existence that could be crushed with a single hand. You only obtained a trace of charm. No wonder this world could accept you. The wisdom ancestor looked at the creature with a faint smile on his face. However, in just an instant, he had seen through everything and understood why he and that pinnacle expert would receive two completely different treatments in this world. He and the peak powerhouse were actually somewhat similar in nature. They were both creatures formed from spirituality, born from the source of the universe, and a type of law brought about by the otherworldly entity. The only difference between them was that the wisdom ancestor's law that belonged to the otherworldly entity was even denser and purer. Because of this density and purity, the wisdom ancestor had completely transcended the world. Just his existence alone was enough to cause considerable damage to the world, making it so that the world couldn't even spread its power to them. It was precisely because of this that there were only rumbles of thunder above his head at this moment, and not layers upon layers of tribulations and bolts of lightning. It was precisely because the world's power couldn't get close that there was such a rumble. In comparison, although the peak powerhouse was essentially the source of the universe and the laws brought about by the otherworldly entity, because the laws that belonged to the otherworldly entity were relatively few, they didn't exceed the limits of the world's tolerance. In this way, when they stepped into the world, it was equivalent to sending themselves to the world's mouth, allowing the world to easily and comfortably devour and assimilate them.